Hey there and welcome back. If you are settled now, the lamp turned down low and the day finally loosening its hold on you, then good, because tonight we are going somewhere that no longer quite exists, a way of seeing the world that has almost entirely slipped away from us. I want to take you back into the mind of the Victorians, not the Victorians of the railways and the factories and the great grey cities, though all of that is there too, but the other Victorians, the ones who lived in a world still thick with meaning, where a bird at the window could carry a message, where a mirror was a doorway that wanted watching, where the spilling of the salt and the turning of the moon and the folding of the linen all meant something, and where the dead were felt to be not so very far away. It is a softer, stranger, more enchanted world than the one we live in now, and you do not need to believe a word of it to step inside it tonight. You need only let your mind loosen and come with me back into an age when the ordinary surface of life was threaded everywhere with the extraordinary. And before the evening is out, I will take you into a darkened parlour with the lamp turned almost to nothing and a ring of hands joined upon a table, where men and women very much like us sat in the hush and believed, with all their hearts, that they were about to speak with the dead. It is a realm we have mostly forgotten, this one, paved over by our own certainties, and yet it was not so long ago, and it was not the world of fools. These were clever, capable people, the people who built the modern age, and they held these beliefs alongside their engines and their telegraphs without feeling any great contradiction, and that is part of what makes them so worth understanding. If walking quietly through these vanished ways of seeing is something you find you would like to do again, you are always welcome to subscribe, and to come back the next time we go wandering somewhere like this, into some other corner of the past that the present has half buried. There is no hurry about any of it. The whole point of tonight is simply to spend a few unhurried hours inside a lost world, to let it become real to us again for a little while, to walk its lamplit rooms and learn its signs and feel, as its people felt, that the world was a far more meaningful and mysterious place than we usually allow it to be. So picture this. It is evening in a Victorian house, somewhere in the middle of the century, the gas just lit or the oil lamps glowing, the curtains drawn against the dark, a fire in the grate. It is, on the face of it, an ordinary room, a parlour with its heavy furniture and its framed pictures and its clutter of ornaments, a clock ticking on the mantel, a mirror above the fireplace, a vase of flowers on the table. An ordinary room in an ordinary house on an ordinary evening. But look a little closer, and the room begins to speak a language we have forgotten. The flowers in that vase were chosen, very likely, to say something. Each bloom a word in a code the whole household understood. The way the table is laid, the way the salt sits, the small habits of the people moving through the room, all of it is shaped by a web of belief so deep and so familiar to them that they scarcely notice it themselves. That clock on the mantel will one day be stopped at the very minute of a death. That mirror will one day be covered with a cloth. This is a house that lives inside an invisible realm of meaning. And tonight, come with me. We are going to learn to see it. Let us begin with the simplest thing of all, which is that to be a Victorian was to live in a world where almost nothing was merely itself. We move through our own days assuming most of the time that things are just things, that a bird is a bird, and a dropped spoon is a dropped spoon, and the world is a great machine of cause and effect with no particular interest in us. The Victorians did not live that way, or rather, a great many of them did not all the way down. They lived in a world that was still, in its bones, enchanted, a sphere where the surface of ordinary life floated upon a deeper sea of meaning, and where the signs of that deeper life were forever breaking through into the everyday in the flight of a bird, the guttering of a candle, the pattern of the tea leaves left in the bottom of a cup. To them the scene was watching and speaking, and the wise person was the one who knew how to read what it said. And here is the matter that most surprises us. Looking back, the point we find hardest to hold in our minds. This was the very same age that laid the railways across the country and ran the telegraph wires beneath the oceans, that built the engines and the factories and the great iron bridges that gave us so much of the hard machinery of the modern realm. We tend to imagine that science and superstition cannot share a house, that as the one comes in at the door, the other must fly out at the window, and so we expect the Victorians, those grand builders and engineers, to have been brisk, rational, disenchanted people. But they were not. They were both at once, holding the engine and the omen in the same hand, reading the railway timetable and the tea leaves with the same untroubled mind, and they felt far less contradiction in it than we suppose they should have. The man who understood the workings of a steam engine might still touch wood, still throw the spilled salt over his shoulder, still feel a cold finger on his spine when an owl called in daylight. The age of science was also, right to the end, an age of magic, and the two lived together in the same houses, in the same minds, far more comfortably than we would ever expect. Why this should be so is a question we will keep circling all evening, but a part of the answer lies right at the start, and it is worth holding on to as we go. The Victorians lived very much closer to death and to chance than we do. Their children died often, and young, in numbers that we can hardly bear to think of. Disease swept through their cities without warning and without cure. Life was fragile, and the line between the comfortable evening and the sudden catastrophe was thin, and they knew it, in their bones, in a way that we, cushioned by our medicine and our safety, have largely forgotten. And when life is that uncertain, when the beloved child may sicken in the morning and be gone by the week's end, the human heart reaches, naturally and almost helplessly, for some sense that the world is not simply random, that there are signs to be read, and precautions to be taken, and meanings to be found, that we are not altogether at the mercy of blind chance. The realm of belief was, among other things, a way of living with terror, a way of feeling that the universe could be read and perhaps a little managed. And that is the deep root from which all the charms and omens and observances of the age grew up. Keep that in mind as we walk behind all the strangeness, the simple human heart of it, a people living close to loss and reaching, as we all reach for meaning. Let us linger a moment on that strange marriage of the modern and the magical, because it is the thing that most needs understanding before we go further, and it is easy to get wrong. We are tempted to imagine two kinds of Victorian, the rational engineer on the one hand and the credulous old woman on the other, science in the drawing room and superstition in the kitchen, and to suppose the two had nothing to do with each other. But that is not how it was at all. The very same person held both. The mistress of the house who consulted the new household manuals on hygiene and the proper management of a modern home would also cover her mirrors when death came and throw the spilled salt across her shoulder without a second thought. The educated man who read his Darwin and his Lyell, who understood the age of the rocks and the descent of the species, might still feel the hair rise on his neck at an owl in daylight. The beliefs were not the property of the ignorant. They were the common inheritance of nearly everyone, woven so deep into the texture of life that they were performed without reflection, below the level of argument, in the body rather than the reasoning mind. And this is the heart of it, that superstition and reason do not live in different rooms of the mind, but in the same room, side by side, untroubled by each other's company. A person may know perfectly well in the daylight part of the mind that a broken mirror is only broken glass, and feel all the same, in the older and deeper part, a cold flicker of unease at the breaking. The Victorians did not resolve this tension because they did not, mostly, experience it as a tension. The realm of signs and the world of engines were both simply the world, the one no more strange to them than the other, and they moved between them without friction. We do the same. If we are honest, we carry our phones, those small miracles of pure science, and we still would not walk under a ladder, still feel the small clutch at the heart on Friday the 13th, still say touch wood and mean, somewhere below meaning it, exactly what our great-grandparents meant. The enchanted mind and the modern mind are not two minds, but they are one mind, and it is ours as much as theirs. Come with me, then, into the very start of a Victorian day, because the enchantment began the moment a person opened their eyes, before they had so much as risen from the bed. There was a right and a wrong way to begin the morning, and a careful person attended to it. To get out of bed on the wrong side, the left side, the sinister side, as the old word had it, was to invite a day of ill temper and misfortune, and the phrase has outlived the belief, for we still speak of someone having got out of bed on the wrong side, without remembering that we are repeating a fragment of real Victorian caution. The right foot should touch the floor first, and the day begun rightly would go rightly. It seems a small thing, and it was a small thing, but that is exactly the point about this world, that it was built of small things, of 1,000 tiny observances threaded through the most ordinary moments, each one a way of nudging fortune gently toward the good and away from the ill. And the small observances clustered most thickly around the most ordinary acts. The way you put on your clothes mattered. To button a garment wrongly was to court bad luck for the day, unless you took it off and began again. To put a garment on inside out by accident was, on the other hand, a stroke of good fortune, and the wise course was to leave it as it was, for to correct it deliberately was to throw the luck away. There were observances about the cutting of the nails, the days on which it was lucky or unlucky to do it, an old rhyme running through the days of the week and assigning to each its consequence, so that to cut your nails on a Friday or a Sunday was to ask for sorrow, while another day might bring a gift or a journey. None of these truths took any great effort, and that was their nature. They were the small change of belief, spent unthinkingly through the day, a way of staying on good terms with a world that was felt to be watching and quick to take offence. There is the small daily courtesy of the threshold and the meeting that we should not pass by, the customs that governed how people came and went, for even the ordinary business of visiting was hedged with meaning. To meet someone on the stairs was awkward and faintly unlucky, two people crossing on the same flight, and there were those who would wait at the bottom rather than pass on the steps. To return to the house for something forgotten once you had set out was unlucky, and if you must go back you should sit down a moment before leaving again, to break the bad luck of the return. To leave by a different door than the one you entered was, in some houses, to carry the luck away or to court misfortune. To put your shoes on the table, to open the umbrella in the hall, to cross with someone on the stair, each small movement through the house and its thresholds carried its quiet rule, and a guest brought luck, or its opposite, by the manner of their coming. The first foot at the new year most of all, but lesser visitors too read for the fortune they brought. These small observances of coming and going show us once more how completely the enchantment filled the ordinary, how there was scarcely a movement a person could make through their day that did not brush against some meaning, some rule, some small magic of luck. To rise, to dress, to eat, to light the fire, to leave the house, to meet a friend, to come home again. Every commonplace act had its observances, its right and wrong ways, its omens to be read, and its small precautions to be kept. It was a world thick with meaning to the point of saturation, where nothing was too small to signify, where the whole texture of common life was woven through with the threads of belief. And to move through a Victorian day was to move through a kind of continuous quiet ceremony, half noticed, deeply felt, the ordinary made everywhere significant by the enchanted age that pressed close on every side. What strikes us, looking back, is how the enchantment lived not in the grand moments, but in the texture of the ordinary, in the very grain of the day. We tend to think of superstition as something reserved for the dramatic occasions, the wedding and the funeral, the moment of crisis. But for the Victorians it was woven through the whole fabric of common life, through the dressing and the washing and the laying of the fire and the cutting of the bread, a continuous low hum of meaning under everything, so that a person was never entirely off duty, never wholly outside the web of signs. To live in that world was to live with a kind of constant gentle attention, a watchfulness for the small messages the day might bring, the dropped knife that meant a visitor, the stranger in the tea, the coal that leapt from the fire toward you bearing news. It was tiring perhaps in a way, this ceaseless reading of the world, and it was also, we might think, a kind of companionship, for an age so full of signs was a world that was always speaking to you, always paying you the compliment of its attention, never merely indifferent. The Victorian rose into a morning that meant something and moved through a day that watched him, and there was a strange warmth in that, for all its anxieties, that our own disenchanted mornings have quite lost. Now come with me to the heart of the house, to the hearth and the kitchen and the table, because it was here, around the making of warmth and the making of food, that the household magic gathered most thickly. The fire itself was alive with meaning. A Victorian sitting before the grate read it as we might read a letter, for the fire was forever sending messages. A bright spark clinging to the back of the grate foretold a coming visitor or a piece of good news. A hollow cake of soot fluttering on the bars, what they called a stranger, meant exactly that, a stranger soon to arrive. A coal that leapt out toward you carried fortune of one kind or another, to be read by its shape, a purse or a coffin, money coming or grief. The way the fire burned, bright or sullen, the way it roared or sank, all of it was watched and interpreted, and to a people who sat each evening before an open fire, as we sit before our screens, the grate was a kind of oracle, glowing and shifting and speaking in the heart of the home. And then the salt, that small white, everyday thing that carried such an enormous weight of meaning. To spill the salt was among the most universally feared of small mishaps, an omen of coming sorrow or quarrel, and the remedy was known to everyone, and is known in fragments even to us. You took a pinch of the spilled salt in your right hand, and threw it over your left shoulder, into the face, as the old idea had it, of the devil who waited there to do you mischief, and the throwing of it blinded him and undid the harm. We still do it, some of us, half laughing, never quite remembering why, performing a Victorian and far older ritual of protection over a knocked-over salt cellar at the dinner table. Salt was precious, and salt was protective, scattered for luck, used in charms, never lightly wasted, and the spilling of it touched something old and deep, a sense that to waste the protective thing was to leave a door open to the dark. Bread, too, the other staple of the table, was thick with observance. The loaf must be cut, never both ends, and never turned upside down once cut, for a loaf turned on its back in the house was an invitation to misfortune, in some tellings a death, in others simply ill luck and want. The sign of the cross was marked on the dough before baking in many a household, a blessing and a protection folded into the daily bread. To drop a slice butter side down was an omen, to find a hole in the middle of the loaf, what was grimly called a coffin, was a sign of a death to come. The making and the breaking of bread, the most ordinary and most necessary act of the household, was hedged about with care, because bread was life itself, the very substance of survival, and a people who knew real hunger did not treat the staff of life carelessly, and wrapped it, naturally, in reverence and in dread. Around the hearth and the table, then, in the warmth and the food at the centre of the home, the older age pressed closest, for these were the places where life was sustained, and where the fear of life failing was therefore never far away. There is a deeper reason still that the fire held such power over the Victorian imagination, and it is worth pausing on, for the hearth was not merely where the omens were read, but the very heart and symbol of the home itself. The fire was the centre around which the household gathered, the source of warmth and light and cooked food, the thing that had to be tended and kept alive, that died in the night and was reborn each morning by careful hands. To a family it was almost a living presence in the house, the household god of the old religions in its newer form, and its moods were watched as one watches the moods of something alive. A fire that burned clear and bright was a happy house. A fire that would not draw, that smoked and sulked, that died for no reason, troubled the whole household, for it seemed to speak of something wrong, some ill luck gathering, some shadow on the home. The keeping of the fire was almost a sacred duty, and to let it go out entirely, especially on certain days, was a serious matter, an opening of the house to cold and to misfortune both. So when the Victorians read their fortunes in the grate, they were reading them in the most charged and central place in the whole house, the living heart of the home, and the messages it sent carried a weight beyond their literal meaning. The bright stranger fluttering on the bars, the coffin-shaped coal, the spark that meant a letter, the cinder that flew out and was caught and read for its shape, all of these were the household fire speaking to the household it warmed, and the family gathered close around it in the evening, in the circle of its light, listening, as it were, to what their own hearth had to tell them. We have lost this almost entirely, we who warm our houses with hidden machinery and gather, if we gather at all, around no central flame. We cannot quite feel what it was to live with an open fire at the heart of every room and every evening, to have that bright, shifting, living thing always there, always to be tended, always, if you believed, speaking. The Victorian hearth was oracle and altar, and the beating heart of the home all at once, and the reading of its omens was only the visible sign of how alive, how nearly sacred that central fire still was. Look up now, with me, at the mirror above the mantelpiece. Because of all the objects in the Victorian house, none was wrapped in stranger or deeper dread than the looking-glass. A mirror was never quite an ordinary thing. It was a surface that held another world, a doorway, a window onto a place that looked exactly like our own and was not. And the Victorians, like many peoples before them, felt instinctively that such a thing was not to be trusted entirely, that it touched on powers better left alone. To break a mirror was to invite 7 years of misfortune, a belief so strong and so widespread that it has come down to us almost unchanged, and the length of the sentence, 7 years, gives a sense of how seriously the breaking was taken. The mirror was thought to hold something of the soul of the one who looked into it, and to shatter it was to shatter, in some sense, a piece of the self, and the long penance of bad luck followed from the injury. But it was around death that the mirror grew most fearful, and here we touch for the first time on the great preoccupation of the age, to which we will return many times tonight. When someone died in a Victorian house, the mirrors were covered, every one of them, draped with cloth or crepe or turned to the wall, and they stayed covered through the whole period of mourning until after the funeral. The reason given was that the soul of the newly dead, loosed in the house and not yet departed, might be caught and trapped in the glass if it passed before an uncovered mirror, held fast in that other world behind the surface, and prevented from going on to its rest. And there was a second fear, darker and more personal, that anyone who saw their own reflection in a mirror in a house where a death had occurred would themselves be the next to die, their image in the glass a summons, a marking out. So the cloths went up over every looking-glass the moment the breath had left the body, and the house went blind, its mirrors shrouded, its bright surfaces hidden, and there was something profound in that darkening, the home turning its many eyes away, refusing to look, while the soul made its passage and the danger hung in the air. There were gentler mirror beliefs too, woven into the brighter occasions of life. A young woman might, on the right night of the year, look into a mirror by candlelight in a darkened room, hoping to see over her shoulder the face of the man she would marry, a piece of hopeful divination. We will meet again when we come to courtship. The mirror could show the future as well as trap the soul, could be a tool of hope as well as an object of dread, and that double nature, promising and threatening at once, is exactly what made it such a charged thing in the Victorian imagination. It hung in every parlour and every bedroom, ordinary and necessary, and it was also a doorway onto the unseen to be used with care and covered in the presence of death, the most everyday object in the house, and the one that touched most directly on the mysteries of the soul. Come to the window now and listen, because the Victorian world was full of voices from the animal kingdom, and almost each creature carried a message if you knew how to read it. The birds above all. To a people who lived closer to the natural world than we do, who saw the birds every day about the eaves and the gardens and the fields, the birds were messengers, forever bringing news from the edge of the unseen. The owl was the most dreaded of them. An owl was a creature of the night and of the churchyard, and to hear one calling near the house, or worse, to see one abroad in the daylight, when it had no business being out, was a grave omen, a sign of death approaching, of someone in the house soon to sicken or to die. The owl's call in the dark drew a cold finger down the spine of the listener, for it was the voice of the night side of the world speaking, and what it spoke of was loss. The smaller birds carried their meanings too, and not all of them dark. The robin was loved and protected, a bird of good omen, and to harm one was to bring misfortune on yourself. The sparrow was thought by some to carry the souls of the dead, so that to kill a sparrow was a fearful thing, an injury to a departed soul, and a sparrow that flew into the house, or worse, a sparrow that came and perched upon the piano, was read as a sign of a death to come. The magpie had its own famous rhyme, the counting rhyme that we still half remember, 1 for sorrow and 2 for joy, by which the number of magpies seen foretold the fortune of the day, and a lone magpie was greeted, to turn aside its sorrow, with a bow or a word of respect. Good morning, Mr. Magpie, a courtesy still paid in country places within living memory. The bird at the window, tapping at the glass, was among the most feared of all, an almost certain sign that death was coming to that house. The creature of the air bringing its summons to the very pane. Come a little closer to the birds, for they deserve more than a passing word, these messengers of the Victorian sky, and the magpie above all has a richer story than its rhyme alone can tell. The counting rhyme, 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, and 4 for a boy, ran on through 5 for silver and 6 for gold, and 7 for a secret never to be told, and the children chanted it, and the grown people half believed it, counting the magpies on the morning's walk, and reading the day's fortune in their number. But the single magpie, the bird of sorrow, was the one that mattered, the one that had to be guarded against, and the ways of turning aside its ill luck were many and oddly courteous. You might raise your hat to it, or bow, or spit, or make the sign of the cross, or speak to it directly. Good morning, Mr. Magpie. How is your lady wife today? Addressing the bird as a person, asking after its family, a strange small ceremony of respect paid to a bird on a hedge to keep the day from turning dark. The magpie was thought unlucky for old reasons half forgotten, an old association with the devil, a bird that had refused to mourn at some sacred death, and the dread of the lone one persisted long after the reasons were lost. And the robin, the magpie's opposite, the beloved bird, carried its own tender weight of belief. To harm a robin was deeply unlucky, for the robin was a holy bird. Its red breast got, the old story said, from drawing a thorn from the brow of Christ upon the cross, stained forever with the sacred blood. To break a robin's eggs was to bring disaster, a broken limb, a house struck down. A robin that came tapping at the window or flew into the house was a different matter, for like other birds at the window it might be an omen of death. The gentlest of birds turned, in that moment, into a messenger of the end. The Victorians loved their robins, fed them, welcomed them, put them on the very Christmas cards they were inventing, and feared them too, a little, when they came too close, for the same bird could be a friend in the garden and a herald at the glass, beloved and dreaded both, like so much in this world where nothing was ever only one thing. And it was not only the birds. The household dog, that most familiar of companions, became an oracle in the hour of sickness, for a dog that howled in the night when someone lay ill within was giving voice to a coming death, sensing what the humans could not, and the howl in the dark was a sound to freeze the blood of a watching family. There was even a remedy, oddly precise, for those who could not bear the omen, to reach beneath the bed and turn over a shoe, and so to turn the luck and silence the meaning of the howl. And then, most beautiful of all the animal beliefs, there were the bees. The bees were held to be wise and close to the soul, and bound to the family that kept them, and they must be told of every great event in the household, every birth and marriage, and above all every death, or they would take offence and leave or die. The telling of the bees was a real and tender custom, a member of the family going out to the hives to whisper the news of a death, to drape the hives in black, so that the bees would know and mourn and stay. And there was a belief, recorded with great feeling, that when a good person lay dying a swarm of bees might come and rest near the house, an honour guard sent to escort the departing soul on its way, lifting and flying off at the very moment of death. In all of this the world of animals was not separate from the human world, but bound to it, watching it, mourning with it, carrying its messages back and forth across the border of the seen and the unseen. Let us dwell a moment more on the telling of the bees, for it is the loveliest of all these customs and deserves to be felt in full. The bees were not quite like other creatures in the Victorian mind, nor in the older folk mind from which the belief descended. They were thought-wise, almost holy, industrious and orderly, and somehow knowing, and they were held to be bound to the family that kept them by a kind of contract, members of the household in their own right, who must be treated with respect and kept informed of the family's affairs. And so, when something of great moment happened in the house, the bees must be told. Death above all. When the master or the mistress of the house died, someone, often the eldest child or a servant who knew the way of it, would go out quietly to the hives and knock gently upon each one and tell the bees, in a low voice, that their keeper was dead. The hives might be draped with a scrap of black crape, put into mourning like the house itself. A portion of the funeral feast might be brought out and left for them. And all of this was done in deadly earnest, for if the bees were not told it was believed, they would resent the neglect, and they would die, or leave, or simply give no more honey, the broken contract punished by the loss of the hive. And the bees foretold death as well as mourned it. A swarm that settled on a dead branch or on the house itself was an omen of a death to come. But the most beautiful belief of all was the one I touched on earlier, that when a truly good person lay dying, the bees might gather, might come and rest about the house in a quiet swarm, an honour guard, drawn by the goodness of the passing soul, waiting, and that at the very moment the breath left the body, the bees would rise together and fly away, escorting the soul on its journey out of the world. There is something almost unbearably tender in that image, the dying saint and the patient bees and the soul carried off on their small wings, and it tells us, better than almost anything, what kind of age this was, a world in which even the bees in the garden were part of the great web of life and death and meaning, bound to the family, mourning its losses, foretelling its sorrows, and escorting its best souls home. We keep bees still, some of us, but we do not tell them our griefs, and the hives no longer go into mourning, and the loss of that, the loss of a world in which the bees would weep for you, is a small measure of how much enchantment we have let slip away. Step outside with me now, under the open sky, because the heavens themselves were a vast page of omen to the Victorian eye, and the moon above all governed the fortunes of those below. The new moon was a moment of power, to be greeted with care. To see the new moon for the first time through glass, through a window pane, was unlucky, and the wise person went out of doors to look on it clean. To see it over the right shoulder was fortunate, over the left unlucky, and straight ahead best of all. Many would turn the silver in their pocket at the sight of the new moon, or bow to it, or make a wish, and the turning of the coin was a charm for money through the coming month. To point at the moon was discourteous and unwise. The moon ruled the tides, and the moon ruled the blood, and the moon ruled luck, waxing and waning through the month, and a careful person lived in rhythm with it, planting and cutting and beginning new ventures by its phases, for what was begun under a waxing moon would grow, and what was begun under a waning moon would dwindle. The weather, too, was dense with sign and saying, and much of the old weather lore was sound observation dressed as omen, the red sky at morning that warned the shepherd, the ring around the moon that foretold rain. But woven through the practical lore was a deeper kind of meaning, for the weather was thought to answer to human events, to mark and comment upon them. Rain falling upon a funeral was no misfortune but a blessing, for the rain meant the dead would rest easy and reach heaven, happy the corpse the rain rains on. A clap of thunder heard after a burial was the very sound of the departed soul arriving at the gates of heaven, received at last. The sun breaking through upon a wedding party was a blessing on the marriage, and rain upon it a sorrow, though here too there were kinder readings, for some held that rain on the wedding day washed away the tears the bride would otherwise shed in her marriage. The sky watched the great human moments and spoke its verdict upon them, and the people below looked up and read the verdict in the cloud and the light and the fall of the rain. Let us go back to the moon for a moment, and to the old divinations worked beneath it, for the moon was the great clock and the great oracle of the folk world, and the Victorians, town dwellers though so many had become, still kept its rhythms in their bones. To see the new moon for the first time was a moment to be marked, and the wise turned the silver in their pocket and made their wish and bowed, and a girl might curtsy to the new moon and say her rhyme, asking it to show her, in a dream that night, the face of the man she would marry. The moon governed the planting and the cutting, for what was sown as the moon waxed would grow strong, and what was sown as it waned would wither, and the gardener and the farmer planted by it still. The moon governed the cutting of the hair and the nails, the killing of the pig, the brewing and the baking, a whole calendar of right and wrong times written in the waxing and the waning of the light in the sky. And the full moon had its own power to disturb the sleep, to turn the mind, to draw out the strange, the very word for madness bound up with the moon's old name, and a person acting wildly was moonstruck, touched by the lunatic light. The moon was watched and read and lived by, and there is something in that we have wholly lost, we who scarcely notice the moon at all, who could not say tonight whether it waxes or wanes, who have lit our nights so bright that the moon has become a thing we forget for weeks together. The Victorian looked up and knew the moon, marked its phases, turned the silver at its new appearance, planted and cut and wished by it, lived in the old rhythm of its monthly dying and rebirth. The moon was a presence in their lives, a power, a clock, an oracle, and the loss of it from our awareness, the forgetting of the moon, is one more small measure of how far we have drifted from the world of signs, where the light in the night sky was watched and loved and obeyed and meant something, and was not, as it is to us, merely there. There is something in all this sky reading that draws us close to the Victorian heart, for it shows us a people who did not feel themselves alone under an indifferent heaven. Their sky was not the cold and empty space of our own understanding, the vast dark scattered with burning gas. It was a living canopy that bent over their lives and took notice of them, that blessed their weddings and received their dead, and turned their fortunes with the turning moon, a sky that cared. And whatever we make of the truth of it, there is a kind of consolation in that vision that we have traded away for our accuracy, the sense of living beneath a heaven that was paying attention, that marked your wedding, and wept at your graveside and hung its new moon in the west for you to wish upon. The Victorians walked under a sky full of meaning, and lifted the silver in their pockets to the new moon, and felt, looking up, that they were seen. Come down with me to the sea and the ships. The sailors were the most superstitious of all the Victorians, and no wonder, for no one lived closer to sudden death than the men who went down to the sea in ships, and a world that fragile breeds a world of belief. A sailor would not sail on a Friday if he could help it, that unluckiest of days. He would not have certain words spoken aboard, would not name the pig or the rabbit or the minister, words that brought ill luck on the water. He prized a call above almost anything. The birth membrane saved and carried, for a call was proof against drowning, and a man with a call in his sea chest believed the sea could not take him, and calls were bought and sold among seafaring men for good money. He read the birds and the weather and the behaviour of the sea with a watchfulness that was half hard-won knowledge and half omen, for at sea the line between the practical and the magical blurred entirely, and the same red sky that warned of a storm by sound observation also spoke, to the sailor's mind, of the sea's mood and intention. The ship herself was a thing of belief, named and blessed and launched with ceremony, for a ship improperly launched was unlucky for all her life, and the breaking of the bottle across her bow was a libation, an offering, older than anyone aboard remembered. A woman aboard was unlucky, the old hands said, though a naked woman, the figurehead at the prow, calmed the sea. To whistle aboard was to whistle up a wind, dangerous, and a becalmed crew might whistle for a breeze with care. St. Elmo's fire, the strange glow that played about the masts in certain weathers, was watched with awe, a sign from the deep, good or ill by how it appeared. The sailor lived in a world charged at every point with sign and danger, reading the sea for its temper, and warding himself with his call and his customs, and we should not wonder at it, for he worked in the very jaws of death, on the great indifferent sea that took men without warning and without mercy, and against that vast power his small charms and careful customs were the only defence his heart could muster. Come back indoors with me, into the clutter of the Victorian home, because the ordinary objects of daily life were divided, in the Victorian mind, into the lucky and the unlucky, and a person moved among them with a quiet care. The umbrella was a thing of danger when misused. To open an umbrella indoors was to invite misfortune into the house, a belief still alive among us, and to drop one on the floor was an omen darker still, a sign of bad news or worse to come, and no one would pick up their own dropped umbrella but waited for another to do it for them, to break the ill luck. Shoes carried meaning too. New shoes must never be placed upon a table, for that was an omen of death, perhaps an echo of an old custom of the dead. To put the shoes on the wrong feet, to cross them upon the floor, all of it was watched. and the giving of certain things as gifts required care, for a gift of a knife or any sharp blade would cut the friendship between giver and receiver, unless the receiver gave back a small coin, a penny, to turn the gift into a purchase, and so preserve the bond. The pins and needles, those small, sharp, everyday things, had their own dense lore. To find a pin and pick it up was lucky. See a pin and pick it up. All the day you'll have good luck, the rhyme that children still chant without knowing its age. To give a friend a pin was to risk a quarrel. To leave a pin lying was to leave luck on the ground. And then there were the great protective objects, the parts kept and hung and treasured for the good fortune they drew, and the ill they turned aside. The horseshoe above all, nailed above the door with its points turned upward so the luck would not run out of it, a charm against evil and a magnet for good fortune, hung over countless Victorian doorways and hanging over a few even now. There was the lucky coin kept in the pocket, the caul saved from a berth, the bit of coal pressed into the hand of the first visitor of the new year. A horseshoe found by chance in the road was a treasure. The world of objects was not neutral. Everything had its charge, lucky or unlucky, protective or perilous, and to live well was to know which was which, to hang the horseshoe and pick up the pin, and never, ever open the umbrella beneath your own roof. There is a whole secret grammar of the body and its small accidents that we have hardly touched, the everyday omens that attended a person from hour to hour, and they are worth gathering, for they show how densely the ordinary day was sown with meaning. An itching palm foretold money, the right palm money coming, the left money going, and a person with an itching right hand looked out for a windfall. An itching nose meant a visitor, or a quarrel, or a kiss by the various tellings, and so did a burning ear, for someone was speaking of you when your ear burned, the right ear good words and the left ill, and you might bite your finger, or pinch the burning ear to make the slanderer bite their tongue. A shiver down the spine for no reason was someone walking over the place where your grave would one day be. A twitching eye foretold tears or laughter. The accidental biting of the tongue meant you had just told a lie, or were about to hear one. To stumble on the stair, to drop a glove, to sneeze at a particular moment, each carried its small reading, the body and its mishaps, forever sending up these little signals to be noticed and interpreted. And the involuntary acts had their meanings too, the sneeze above all, that sudden violent expulsion that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the will. To sneeze was a small crisis. The old belief held that in the sneeze the soul might briefly leave the body, or that evil might enter, and so the sneeze was met at once with a blessing. Bless you, God bless you. A charm of protection spoken over the vulnerable moment. A custom so deep that we keep it still, blessing the sneezer without the least idea that we are guarding their soul. To sneeze once, twice, 3 times had its meanings, and to sneeze on a particular day of the week by yet another rhyme foretold the fortune of the day. The hiccup meant someone was thinking of you. The yawn must be covered not from politeness only, but lest the soul escape or a spirit enter at the open mouth. The body was a kind of instrument on which the unseen world played its small messages, the itch and the shiver and the burning ear and the sneeze. An attentive Victorian read their own body through the day as they read the fire and the birds and the sky, finding in its small involuntary motions the constant quiet commentary of a world that never stopped speaking. What we see in all of this, threading through the lucky pins and the perilous umbrellas, is a kind of practical magic, a way of taking small actions in a frightening world, of doing something rather than nothing in the face of a fortune that could not otherwise be controlled. There is a deep human comfort in it, in the horseshoe over the door and the coin turned at the new moon, the comfort of feeling that one is not entirely helpless, that there are steps one can take, charms one can keep, approaching as one can observe, but hold the darkness a little way off. We are not perhaps so very different. We knock on wood still, and cross our fingers, and carry our own small lucky things, and feel a flicker of unease at a broken mirror or a Friday the 13th, fragments of the old enchanted life surviving in us, half believed, half laughed at, but not quite let go. The Victorians simply lived more fully and more consciously inside that scene than we do, surrounded by their charged and meaningful objects, taking their small daily actions against the dark. There is a whole old belief gathered around the home itself, the house as a thing to be protected, that we have only touched upon, and it is worth opening, for the Victorian house was guarded at every threshold against the entry of ill fortune. The doorway above all was a place of power, the boundary between the safe inside and the dangerous outside, and it was watched and warded with care. The horseshoe over the door we have met points upward to hold the luck. But there was more. The first foot across the threshold in the new year decided the fortune of the year to come, and the first footing was a serious business for the right visitor. A dark-haired man bearing coal and bread and salt and a coin brought luck for the whole year, while the wrong one, a woman or a fair or red-haired man, or anyone empty-handed, brought misfortune, and households arranged matters carefully so that the right first foot should cross the threshold before any other. To carry something out of the house before something had been brought in on the New Year's morning was to carry the luck out with it. Within the house there were the smaller wardings and watchings. The threshold of a new home was crossed with care by the bride, carried over it. A new house, or a new baby, might be protected by old marks and old charms. The salt and the iron and the hold stone did their quiet work, and there were the unlucky acts to be avoided within the walls, the opening of the umbrella, the placing of new shoes on the table, the crossing of knives, the singing before breakfast that meant crying before night, the whole web of small prohibitions that kept the household safe. To keep a house in the Victorian age was to keep it not only clean and warm and fed, but lucky, to manage its fortune as carefully as its larder, to ward its thresholds and observe its prohibitions, and maintain it as a safe place in a dangerous world. The house was a fortress against more than weather, and the mistress who ran it was its guardian against misfortune as much as against dirt, performing, in the very running of her home, 100 small acts of protection that she would scarcely have called magic, but that were the lineal descendants of the oldest house magic in the world. Let us turn now to the calendar itself, to the days and the dates and the numbers, because time too was charged with fortune for the Victorians, and some days were bright and some were shadowed, and the wise person knew the difference. Friday was the great unlucky day, shadowed by old religious memory, the day of the crucifixion, and so a day on which it was unwise to begin anything of importance. To start a new piece of work on a Friday, to set out on a journey, to move house, above all to marry, was to build on poor foundations, and many a Victorian would put off a beginning rather than commence it on a Friday. Sailors would not willingly sail on a Friday. A child born on a Friday, in some tellings, was marked for misfortune, though the old rhyme of the days of birth gave each day its character, and Friday's child was loving and giving in that gentler version. The week itself was red for luck, Monday for health, Wednesday the best of all to marry, the days carrying their fortunes like colours. And then the number, that most famous of all the unlucky things, 13. 13 at a table was the worst of omens, a sure sign that one of the company would die within the year, and it was traced to the Last Supper, where 13 sat down and one was betrayed and all were scattered. So strong was this dread that hostesses went to great lengths never to seat 13, and there grew up, in time, a profession of 14th guests, men who could be called upon to make the number safe. Friday, the 13th, when the unlucky day and the unlucky number fell together, was the most shadowed date in the calendar, doubly cursed, a day to step carefully through. The numbers carried meaning everywhere, the lucky and the unlucky, the odd and the even. And a people who read the world for signs naturally read its numbers too, finding fortune and misfortune written into the very count of things. But the calendar was not all shadow, for it held its bright and magical days as well, its turning points where the veil between the worlds grew thin, and wonderful things became possible. There was May Day with its flowers and its dew, that dew of May morning gathered to bring beauty and luck. There was Midsummer, a night of old power. There was Halloween above all, the night when the dead drew near and the future might be glimpsed, a night of divination and of games that were half in earnest, the apple peeled in one long strip and thrown over the shoulder to fall in the shape of a lover's initial, the nuts set to burn upon the fire to test a courtship. And there was Christmas, deepest and richest of all, a season we think of now as cosy and bright, but which the Victorians knew also as a time when the supernatural pressed close, when ghosts walked and stories of them were told around the fire, when the year turned in the dark and the old powers stirred. The Victorian year was a wheel of meaning, its days and seasons each carrying their fortune and their magic, the shadowed Fridays and the perilous 13ths balanced by the bright dew of May and the thin veil of Halloween and the haunted warmth of Christmas, the whole turning calendar alive with significance. Let us return to the calendar's brightest and strangest night, to Halloween, for of all the turning points of the Victorian year, this was the one most charged with magic, the night when the veil between the living and the dead, and between the present and the future, was thinnest, and when a young person might, with the right charm, lift a corner of that veil and peer through. The games of Halloween were games of divination, played half in laughter and half in real hope, and most of them were about love, about the great question of whom one would marry. A girl might peel an apple in one long unbroken strip and throw the peel over her shoulder, and the shape it made upon the floor would be the initial of her future husband's name. She might stand before a mirror in a darkened room at midnight, eating an apple or combing her hair, and watch for his face to appear over her shoulder in the glass. She might float 2 nuts upon the fire, named for herself and her sweetheart, and watch whether they burned quietly side by side, a happy marriage, or whether one leapt away, a parting. There were darker divinations too, for those bold enough, ways of learning not love but death, of seeing which of the household would not live out the year. There was the old and frightening custom of watching in the church porch on certain nights, where the watcher would see the shades of those doomed to die pass before them into the church. There was the casting of lots, the reading of signs, the whole apparatus of a night when the future was felt to be readable and the dead near enough to consult. We have kept Halloween, of course, though we have turned it almost entirely into a children's carnival of sweets and costumes, and we have forgotten mostly that it was once a night of real and earnest divination, when young women peered into mirrors, hoping and dreading to see a face, and the bold watched in the church porch for the passing of the doomed. Beneath our pumpkins and our masks lies an old, old night, the night when the dead came close and the future could be read, and the Victorians stood much nearer to that old meaning than we do, playing their apple games in deadly half-earnest, laughing and shivering at once. Now come with me to one of the sweetest corners of the lost enchantment, the world of courtship and marriage, for here the omens turned mostly toward hope, and a young heart, wishing to know its future, had 100 gentle ways to ask. A girl who wished to dream of her future husband had her charms to work on the right nights of the year. She might sleep with a sprig of rosemary or a slice of wedding cake beneath her pillow, passed 9 times through a wedding ring, to summon his face into her dreams. She might, on Halloween or Midsummer Eve, Perform the candle and mirror divination we touched on earlier, sitting alone in a darkened room before a looking glass, eating an apple or brushing her hair, and watching for the face of her destined love to appear over her shoulder in the glass. She might count the stones of her fruit, the petals of a flower, the buttons on a dress. He loves me not, reading her fortune in the count. The whole apparatus of love divination was vast and tender, and mostly the province of young women, a way of peering hopefully into a future that mattered more to them than almost anything. For marriage was a woman's whole estate, and the question of whom she would marry the great question of her life. And when the marriage came, it carried its own thick garland of observances, many of which we keep even now without knowing why. The bride must wear something old and something new, something borrowed and something blue, each carrying its protective meaning, the old for continuity, the new for the future, the borrowed for the luck of a happy wife passed on, the blue for fidelity and for purity. She must not make her own wedding dress, nor wear it complete before the day, nor see herself entire in the mirror in it before she left for the church, leaving off a glove or a final touch to be added at the last. The groom must not see the bride before the ceremony on the wedding morning. The bride must step into the church and over the threshold of her new home with care, carried over the threshold lest she stumble and bring ill luck on the marriage. The very day was chosen for luck, and the rhyme consulted, and Saturday, oddly to us, thought by some the unluckiest wedding day of all. The whole of it, the divinations and the dress law and the threshold customs, speaks of how much was felt to ride on marriage and how uncertain its fortunes were. A marriage was for life, with no undoing, and into it a young woman ventured her whole future happiness, her security, her very survival, upon a choice made young and often with little knowledge. No wonder, then, that the moment was hedged about with every protection that belief could offer, every charm to choose rightly, and every observance to bless the union once made. Behind pretty customs, the cake beneath the pillow and the something blue, lay the same deep thing we keep finding under all the magic of this age, the human heart reaching for some assurance in the face of a future it could not control, some sense that the great irreversible step might be taken safely, that the omens might be read and the luck secured, that love might be made to come out right. We still throw the confetti and carry the bride across the threshold, fragments of that old reaching the world of meaning surviving in the happiest of our ceremonies. From the marriage bed we come, as life comes, to the cradle, and hear the enchanted world pressed close and anxious. For nowhere was a Victorian family more vulnerable than around the birth of a child, and nowhere did belief work harder to hold off the dark. We must remember, to understand the customs of the cradle, how terribly many children died. An infant's hold on life was frail beyond our imagining, and a family might bury several little ones before any grew. And so the arrival of a child was wrapped in a desperate tenderness, and in each protection that custom could provide. The newborn was guarded from the first moment. It was thought unlucky to praise a baby too warmly, to call it beautiful or strong, for fear of drawing the attention of whatever envious powers might wish it harm, and so a kind of protective understatement guarded the cradle. The child might be marked with a charm, a coral necklace worn against harm and against the pains of teething, coral being a protective stone of old. There were observances about the very first things a child must do and touch, each setting the pattern of the life to come. A baby should be carried upward before it was carried down, up the stairs or lifted high on a chair or a Bible, if there were no stairs above, so that it would rise in the world rather than fall. The first gifts placed in a baby's hand at its first visiting were chosen for meaning: an egg, salt, bread, a coin, each a wish for fullness and savour and sustenance and wealth in the life ahead. The child born with a caul, The remnant of the birth membrane upon its head was marked as lucky and as proof against drowning, and the caul itself was saved and dried and treasured, even sold, for sailors prized a caul above almost anything as a charm against death at sea. The day of the week of the birth set the character by the old rhyme, Monday's child fair of face, Tuesday's full of grace, down to the child born on the Sabbath, bonny and blithe and good and gay. Underneath the charms and the coral and the careful liftings lay a parent's terror, plain and timeless, the fear of losing the child, and the customs of the cradle are perhaps the most touching of all the realm of belief's workings because the love and the fear in them are so nakedly human. To us, secure in our medicine, a baby's survival is the ordinary expectation. To the Victorian parent, it was a hope held against fearful odds, a small life that might be taken at any moment by a fever or a flux that nothing could cure, and so they did the only things they could. They hung the coral and saved the caul, and lifted the child upward and guarded their praise, performing their small magics of protection over the cradle, doing something, anything, against the helplessness they felt. There is no laughing at this. Behind the quaint customs is the oldest and deepest of human loves, and the oldest and deepest of human fears, and the charms around the Victorian cradle are the marks of a love trying, with the only tools it had, to keep a fragile life safe in a dangerous world. Let us turn, near the end, to the children, for childhood was its own enchanted country within the larger one, and the beliefs that ringed a Victorian childhood are among the tenderest and the most revealing of all. From the cradle the child was guarded, as we have seen the caul saved, the coral hung, the careful lifting upward. But the enchantment did not end with infancy, for childhood itself was lived inside a dense web of small magics, the rhymes and games and beliefs that children kept among themselves, and that the grown world half taught and half simply let them inherit. The child learned not to step on the cracks in the pavement, lest something dreadful follow. The child learned to hold its breath past a graveyard, and to cross its fingers when it told a small untruth, and to wish on the first star, starlight, star bright, and on the white horse, and on the load of hay, and on the eyelash blown from the finger. The child learned to make a wish when two people said the same word at once, and to link the little fingers and not speak until the wish was made. A whole secret world of childish magic, passed from child to child in the playground and the street, below the notice of the grown, and the grown realm wrapped the child in its own protective beliefs, for a child was precious and vulnerable, and so much might befall it. The first tooth lost was attended with custom, thrown into the fire or given to a mouse, with a wish for a strong new tooth to replace it. The child's hair and nails were cut with care for the luck of it. The child was guarded against the evil eye, against the overwarm praise that might draw ill fortune, against the thousand small dangers a loving and fearful family saw threatening the little life. And much of what the child absorbed in this way, it carried for the whole of its life. The rhymes never quite forgotten, the small gestures kept up half unconsciously into age, the crossing of fingers and the wishing on stars and the not stepping on the cracks, the enchanted age entering through childhood so deep that it could never fully be shed. We carry it still, most of us, the fragments of that childhood magic, the wish on the star, the crossed fingers, the held breath, planted in us so young and so deep that we keep them without choosing to, the last living roots of the older world growing quietly in the soil of our own childhoods, Victorian and ancient and undying, handed down through the children who never quite stop believing. Let us turn to something gentler now, and altogether lovelier, the language of flowers, for the Victorians built an entire silent vocabulary out of blossoms, a code by which a posy could speak what the lips, in that careful and constrained age, could not. In a time when so much went unsaid, when a young man and woman could not freely speak their hearts, when emotion was bound tight by propriety, the flowers spoke for them. Every bloom carried a meaning, fixed and known and printed in the little dictionaries of the language of flowers that sat on so many parlour tables, and a bouquet was a sentence, a message, a letter that could be sent in perfect safety beneath the eyes of the world, for only the sender and the receiver, consulting their flower books, knew what it truly said. The red rose meant love, as it means still, the deepest declaration a flower could make. The red tulip was a declaration of love also, a confession. The forget-me-not asked, in its very name, for true love and remembrance. The ivy meant fidelity and lasting attachment, the wedding flower clinging and faithful. But the code ran far beyond love into every shade of feeling. The yellow rose might mean jealousy or a waning affection, a warning folded into a gift. The marigold meant grief, the cypress mourning, the rosemary remembrance, flowers for sorrow and for the grave. A striped carnation was a refusal, a yellow carnation, disdain. The columbine meant folly, the lavender distrust, and to send these was to send a rebuke beneath a smile. Even the way the flowers were given carried meaning. A flower offered upside down reversing its message, the ribbon tied to the left meaning the message was about the giver, and to the right about the receiver. A whole grammar of presentation layered over the vocabulary of the blooms. There is the matter of colours and their meanings, which ran all through the Victorian world, for colour spoke as flowers spoke, and a careful person knew what each one said. Green was the unluckiest colour of all, widely feared, a colour not to be worn at a wedding above all, for green was the colour of the fairies, and to wear it was to court their jealous attention, and many a bride would have no green about her, no green in the dress, no green in the flowers, the very phrase passing down, married in green, ashamed to be seen. Some would have no green in the house at all. Blue, by contrast, was lucky and protective and pure, the colour of faithfulness, which is why the bride wore something blue, and blue beads were hung on children, and even on animals against the evil eye. White was for purity and for weddings, but white was also oddly a colour of death in some uses, the white of the shroud, the white flowers of the funeral, and white flowers brought into a house. Lilies above all could be an omen of a death to come. Red was the colour of life and of blood and of protection. Red thread tied about a child or a beast to guard it. Red coral hung on the cradle. Black was the colour of death and mourning, as we have seen, the whole apparatus of grief draped in unshining black. Yellow could mean jealousy or faithlessness, the yellow rose of waning love. And the colours carried their meanings into everything, the clothes, the flowers, the ribbons, the very furnishings, so that a world richly aware of the language of colour read messages and omens in the shades around it, as it read them in the blooms and the birds. We keep a fragment of this, the bride in her white and her something blue, the black of our own funerals, but we have lost the dense old grammar of it, the fear of green, the protection of red, the death in the white lily, the whole spectrum of meaning that the Victorians saw in colour. To them the world was painted in significance, every shade a word, and the choosing of a colour, for a dress, or a posy, or a room, was never merely a matter of taste but of meaning, and of luck, and of the old careful avoidance of the shades that brought misfortune. Let me show you a single posy, made up and given, so that you can see the language of flowers, not as a list, but as a living message passing between two hands. Imagine a young man who may not speak his heart, for the proprieties forbid it, gathering his flowers with care, each one chosen from the dictionary of their meanings, and binding them into a small tight nosegay to be given, in front of the whole watching family, to the young woman he adores. He sets at its heart a red rose. For love, the boldest word he dares to say. He adds a sprig of fern for sincerity, that she may know his heart is true and not a trifling. He tucks in a few forget-me-nots, asking, in their very name, that she remember him and keep her love faithful. He binds it perhaps with ivy, for fidelity and lasting attachment, the promise of an attachment that will cling and endure. And he ties the ribbon to the left, so that she will know the message speaks of him, of his own heart, and presents it to her with a bow and not a word, a whole declaration held out in a fist of flowers that the watching family sees only as a pretty courtesy. And she, taking it, reading it, knowing the language as well as he, understands every word of the silent speech, the love declared, the sincerity vowed, the faithfulness asked, the lasting attachment promised, all of it spoken to her in flowers beneath the eyes of the world that may not be told. She may answer in kind the next day, with a posy of her own, an acceptance or a gentle refusal, or a hope deferred, a striped carnation for no, a circle of meanings only the two of them can read. There is a whole courtship that might be conducted so, in flowers, beneath the surface of the permitted, a secret tender correspondence carried on in nosegays across a world that forbade plain speaking, and there is something so exactly Victorian in it, this finding of a way to say everything while seeming to say nothing, this pouring of the forbidden heart into the one channel propriety allowed. The flowers spoke what the lips could not, and lovers said in roses and ferns and forget-me-nots all the things the careful age had silenced, and the posy handed across the parlour was a love letter that the watching world could not read. There is something exquisite in this, and something that tells us much about the age, that a people so bound by reticence should have built themselves so rich a secret language, a way of saying everything while appearing to say nothing, of pouring out the heart in a posy of flowers handed across a parlour. It speaks of an age in which feeling ran every bit as deep as it does in ours, but could not be spoken plainly, and so found these beautiful and indirect channels, the flower message, the pressed bloom kept in a book, the meaning hidden in the bouquet. We have lost the code now, mostly though it lingers, in the red roses we still send for love, the lilies we still bring to funerals, fragments of the old floral language surviving in our ceremonies. But the Victorians lived inside it fully, read their bouquets like letters, sent their feelings in flowers, and turned the gardens and the hothouses of their age into a vast vocabulary of the unspoken heart, a way of making even the blossoms on the table carry the weight of all that could not be said aloud. There is the matter of plants and trees beyond the language of the flowers, for the green world was full of power and meaning, and a person moved among the plants with care. Some were lucky and some were perilous, and the household knew the difference. The rowan tree, the mountain ash, was the great protector planted by the door, its wood and its red berries proof against witchcraft and ill-wishing, a sprig of it carried or hung up to ward the home, and many a cottage had its rowan by the threshold for exactly this old reason. Holly and ivy were protective and were brought in at Christmas, the holly's prickles and the ivy's clinging, both holding old meanings of guarding and enduring, though to bring them in too early, or leave them up too late was unlucky. The elder was a tree of deep and double power, never to be cut without asking its leave, for a spirit dwelt in it, and to burn elder wood was to bring misfortune or worse into the house. But others were dangerous to bring indoors, and the rule was strict and widely kept. Hawthorn blossom, the May, for all its beauty in the spring hedges, must never be brought into the house, for it carried the smell of death and would bring death with it, an old dread perhaps rooted in some real faint scent of decay in the blossom, but felt as pure omen. Lilac in some tellings the same. White flowers alone in an arrangement, an omen. And the green of the plants we have met already, the unlucky colour, The garden and the hedgerow and the wood were not neutral ground but a living country of power. The protective rowan and the perilous elder and the death-bearing may, and the Victorian gathering flowers or greenery, planting a tree by the door, bringing the Christmas holly in, moved through that green world with an awareness we have wholly lost, knowing which plants guarded and which threatened, which might be cut, and which must be asked, which might come into the house, and which must stay forever outside the door. The whole growing world was charged with meaning, and the wise lived in accord with it, planting the rowan for protection and leaving the may in the hedge where it belonged. We have not yet spoken of ghosts, and we cannot leave this world without them, for the Victorians believed in haunting as naturally as they believed in anything, and the haunted house was as real to them as the railway timetable. Every old house had its story, its grey lady, or its weeping child, or its phantom coach, its cold room where no fire would warm the air, its footsteps on the stair at night, with no one there to make them, its door that opened of itself. The ghosts were the unquiet dead, those who had died badly, by murder or by suicide, or in some great grief or wrong, and who could not rest but lingered, bound to the place of their sorrow, repeating their last anguish, walking the corridors at the dead hours. To live in an old house was to live, very possibly with the dead, and the Victorians lived with them, told their stories, feared the haunted room, felt the cold spot, heard the footsteps, in a sphere where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and the dead did not always stay decently in their graves. And they loved a ghost story, told it as a high art, especially at Christmas, that season we think of as cosy and bright, but which the Victorians knew also as the great time for tales of the returning dead, told around the fire as the year died in the dark. The best writers of the age turned their hands to the ghost story, and made of it something subtle and chilling and profound, the haunting that was also a haunting of the conscience, the ghost that came to accuse or to warn or to call the living to account. The Christmas ghost story. The family gathered close around the fire, while outside the dark pressed and the wind moved. The teller drawing out the slow horror, the cold creeping up the spine, was one of the great pleasures of the Victorian winter, a playing with fear in the safety of the warm-lit room, a summoning of the dead for the delicious terror of it. We keep a little of this still, our ghost stories and our scary films, our pleasure in being frightened from the safety of the sofa. But the Victorians believed theirs more than we believe ours, set closer to the real dread beneath the pleasure, told their ghost stories in a world where the ghosts might, for all they knew, be real, and listening in the firelight, with the dark house around them, more than half believed. Come with me now a little way out of the respectable parlour and toward the edges of the Victorian world, to the charms and the amulets and the figures who dealt in them, for beneath the polite surface of the age there ran an old deep current of practical magic, and there were those who still kept and sold and worked it. In the countryside above all, but in the towns too, in the poorer streets, there survived the cunning folk, the wise women and wise men, the local practitioners of a magic far older than the Victorian age, to whom ordinary people still came in their troubles. These were not the fashionable mediums of the drawing-room seance, whom we will meet soon, but humbler and older figures, the village wise woman who could cure a wart or a fever, find lost goods, tell a fortune, lift a curse, brew a charm to win a love or protect a household or bless a sickly beast. They worked with herbs and words and small rituals, with charms written on paper and worn against the skin, with the old half-remembered formulae handed down, and the country people consulted them as naturally as they consulted the doctor, more naturally, often, for the wise woman was nearer and cheaper, and spoke the old language they understood. The objects of protection were everywhere among ordinary people. There were the charms worn on the body, the written charm folded small and sewn into the clothing, the protective stone, the hold stone hung up against witchcraft and the nightmare, the iron kept by the door, for iron was proof against the fairies and the ill-wishers. There were the witch bottles buried beneath the hearth or the threshold, filled with pins and nails and other things to turn a curse back upon the one who sent it. There were the marks scratched into the beams and the door frames of houses, the daisy wheels and the tangled lines meant to catch and confound any evil that tried to enter. Much of this was very old, far older than the Victorians, the deep folk magic of the land surviving stubbornly underneath the modern age, and it survived because the fears it answered survived, the fear of the curse, the ill wish, the unlucky neighbour, the unexplained sickness of a child or a cow, the sense that misfortune might be sent and must be guarded against. It is easy to forget this older, rougher layer of the age of signs, beneath the parlour superstitions and the fashionable seances, but it was real, and it was widespread, and it persisted deep into the age of railways and reform. The educated classes might smile at it, the clergy might preach against it, the newspapers might mock the credulous country folk who still consulted the wise woman and feared the witch, but it went on quietly, in the cottages and the back streets, a whole surviving world of practical magic worked by humble hands against the troubles of humble lives. And there is a dignity in it that the mockery missed, for it was the magic of the poor and the powerless, the people who had least defence against the blows of fortune, and so reached most, for whatever protection belief could give them, the charm against the curse, the wise woman's cure, the hold stone over the door. When you have no money and no medicine and no power, and your child lies sick, you will try whatever there is to try, and the cunning folk and their charms were what there was, the old magic surviving where it was needed most, among those for whom the world was hardest. Now to the reading of the future, that most enduring of the magical arts for the Victorians, like every people before them, longed to know what was coming, and there were many ways to ask. The humblest and most domestic was the reading of the tea leaves, a thing done in countless kitchens and parlours. The tea was drunk everywhere, and the leaves left in the bottom of the cup made a ready oracle. The cup was drained, but, for a little, swirled 3 times, and turned over into the saucer, and then the leaves were read in the shapes they made against the china, a ring for marriage, a coffin for death, a letter, a journey, a stranger. The patterns interpreted by anyone with the knack and the law, a fortune told over the breakfast things. It cost nothing, needed no special gift, and brought the reading of the future into the most ordinary moment of the day, the cup of tea, and many a Victorian woman could read the leaves a little, half in fun and half in earnest, turning the cup for a friend. Beyond the tea leaves lay the more serious arts and the people who practised them for a fee. There was the reading of the cards, the ordinary playing cards or the special cards of the fortune teller, laid out in their patterns and read for what they foretold. There was the reading of the palm, the lines of the hand traced for the map of a life, the line of the heart and the line of the head, and the line of life itself, the past and future written in the flesh. There was the crystal, the glass globe gazed into, until the images formed in its depths, the scryer reading the clouds and shapes that rose in the crystal. And there were the fortune-tellers themselves, very often women, working at fairs and in back rooms and at the doors of the well-to-do, a craft that was half tolerated and half condemned, technically against the law under the old Vagrancy Acts, looked down upon by the respectable, and consulted all the same by people of every class, from the servant girl wanting to know of her sweetheart to the fine lady curious about her fortune. To Degman, let us sit a while with the reading of the tea leaves, for it was the gentlest and most domestic of all the divinations, and there is a quiet warmth in it that draws us close to the ordinary Victorian afternoon. Picture the scene. The tea has been drunk, the talk has wandered, The afternoon is soft and unhurried, and one of the women lifts her cup and says, "Half in fun, let me read your fortune." The cup is drained to the last few drops, and held in the left hand, and swirled 3 times around, sunwise, so that the leaves left in the bottom are flung up and scattered against the sides. Then it is turned over into the saucer to drain, and turned back, and the reader bends close and looks into it, at the patterns the wet leaves have made against the white china, and begins to read. A leaf near the rim is something coming soon, near the bottom something far off. A ring means a marriage. A letter, a shape like a letter of the alphabet, means news from a person whose name begins with it. A cluster of leaves means money. A single leaf, a stranger. A winding line, a journey. A heart, a love affair. And a shape like a cross, or a coffin, that the reader passes over quickly or reads kindly, for no one wishes to read death in a friend's teacup of an idle afternoon. There was no great gift required for this, no trance, no spirit, only the knack and the law and a little imagination, and almost any woman could do it a little, reading the leaves for a friend or a daughter as a pleasant amusement of the afternoon, a way of telling small fortunes over the tea things. And yet beneath the fun, there was a flicker of the real, a half-belief that the leaves might truly show something, that the patterns were not wholly random, that the future might leave its trace in the bottom of a cup, and the girl who was told she would marry soon, or take a journey, or receive good news, carried the telling away with her and remembered it, and watched to see if it came true. It is the most harmless of the magical arts, the reading of the tea leaves, domestic and warm and womanly, bound up with the comfort of the afternoon and the company of friends, and it lasted longer than almost any of the others. Within living memory, the grandmother turning the cup and bending close and saying, "Now then, let me see what the leaves have to tell us today." The fortune-teller occupied a curious place in the Victorian world, stigmatized and sought after at once, mostly a woman's trade and mostly the poor's resort, yet creeping upward into the drawing-rooms of the fashionable as the century wore on, and the appetite for the mysterious grew. To consult her was to do something slightly disreputable, slightly thrilling, to step for a moment outside the bounds of respectable rationality and ask the old forbidden question, "What will become of me?" And the question was irresistible. Then as now, for who does not want to know their fortune? Who can resist the promise that the future might be glimpsed, the marriage foretold, the danger warned of, the path ahead lit even a little? The Victorians consulted their tea leaves and their cards and their palms and their crystal gazers, half believing and wholly fascinated, reaching as people always have for some glimpse around the corner of time, some assurance about the unknowable thing that was coming, and the fortune-teller, for her fee, gave them what they came for, a story about their future, a shape imposed upon the dark. Come back once more to the fortune-tellers, for they were a whole world of their own at the edge of respectable life, and their craft deserves a fuller seeing. They worked in many guises and many places. There was the gypsy woman at the fair, dark and knowing, who would read your palm or your fortune for a coin, half feared and half sought, surrounded by an aura of old wandering wisdom and a whisper of danger. There was the backstreet fortune-teller in the poor parts of the towns, the woman to whom servant girls and working women came with their pennies and their questions of love and work and luck. There was the more genteel practitioner who, as the century wore on and the fashion for the mysterious grew, set up in better rooms and received ladies of quality come to have their futures read in elegant surroundings, the same ancient craft dressed up for the drawing-room. And there was the cheap printed fortune-telling book, the dream book that told you what your dreams foretold, the almanac with its predictions, the penny fortune sold at the fair, that the reading of the future made into a small popular trade. The dreams above all were read for their meanings, for the Victorians, like peoples before them, believed that the sleeping mind might see what the waking could not, that dreams were messages, warnings, glimpses of things to come, and there were whole books and traditions for their interpreting. To dream of a wedding foretold a death, and to dream of a death a wedding, for dreams went by opposites in much of the law. To dream of clear water was good and of muddy water ill. To dream of teeth falling out foretold a death in the family, a belief still current and still unsettling to those who wake from such a dream. To dream of a birth, of a journey, of money, of a serpent, each had its reading in the dream books, and a person troubled by a vivid dream might turn to the book or to the wise woman to learn what it foretold, and carry the reading anxiously through the day. The night had its oracle as the day did, the dream as readable as the tea leaves or the fire, and the Victorian woke from a strong dream and wondered what it meant, and looked it up, or asked, and to watch to see whether the thing it foretold would come. Come back to the wise woman a moment, for I have told you that the country people went to her, but not what they went for, and the everyday magic of cure and remedy was perhaps the most used of all the magic of the age. People fell sick, and doctors were costly and far and often useless, and so they went to the wise woman, or worked the old cures themselves, the folk medicine that was half herbcraft and half charm. There were the cures for warts above all, that harmless universal affliction, and the cures were many and strange, to rub the wart with a stolen piece of meat and bury it, so that as the meat rotted, the wart would vanish, to rub it with a snail and impale the snail on a thorn, to count the warts and tie that many knots in a string and bury it, to sell the warts to another for a penny, to touch them to a dead hand. There were charms for the toothache, words written on paper and worn for the ague, for the bleeding that would not stop, for the burn, for the sprain, the old healing words handed down, half prayer and half spell. And there were the protective charms against the deeper troubles, against the ill wish and the curse and the witch, for the belief in witchcraft, though the law no longer hanged for it, had not died among the people. A household that suffered a run of misfortune, the milk that would not churn, the beasts that sickened, the child that wasted, might come to suspect an ill-wishing neighbour, a witch, and seek the wise woman's help to lift the curse and turn it back. The witch bottle was buried beneath the hearth, filled with pins and nails and urine, to torment the witch until she released her victim. The hold stone was hung up against her. Iron was set at the threshold. These were not the genteel superstitions of the parlour, but the hard old magic of people who lived close to want and fear, who had little defence against sickness and misfortune and the malice they suspected behind it, and who reached for the wise woman's charm as the only help within their grasp. It is easy to smile, from our comfort, at the wart cures and the witch bottles. It is better to see the fear and the helplessness beneath them, the people with no doctor and no certainty and no power, working the only magic they had against a world that hurt them, and finding in it, if nothing else, the comfort of having done something, of not being wholly at the mercy of the dark. There is a question we should sit with, gently, before we go further, which is why it should have been so often women who kept and worked this enchanted world. For if you look back over all we have walked through, the hands that did the magic were so often women's hands. It was women who read the tea leaves and turned the cups, women who knew the household charms and warded the thresholds, women who worked the love divinations and laid out the dead and went to tell the bees. It was the village wise woman, more often than the wise man, to whom the country people came. And in the seance, above all, it was women who were the mediums, the great majority of them, the sensitive vessels through whom the spirits spoke. This was no accident, and it tells us something about the lives women led in that age. For women were largely shut out of the official powers of the world, the professions, the universities, the public life, the church's ministry, the whole apparatus of recognized authority which belonged almost entirely to men. And the lost enchantment was a kind of unofficial country where women's authority was allowed, even expected, a realm of knowledge and power that was theirs. The medium especially found in spiritualism something close to a freedom she could find nowhere else. In the seance room she was the centre, the authority, the one through whom the wonders came, and in her trance she might say things, do things, take on a boldness and a voice that no respectable woman could have shown in her own person, for it was not she who spoke, but the spirit, and the spirit might be anyone, might be commanding, might be male, might speak truths. The medium could never have uttered as herself. Spiritualism gave women a platform, a voice, a public role, even a living, and it is no wonder that so many were drawn to it, that it became so much a women's movement, for it opened a door that the rest of the world held shut. There is something to honour in that, beneath all the question of fraud and belief, that in this strange enchanted country, and almost nowhere else, the knowledge and the power and the voice belonged to women who kept the charms and read the future and spoke for the dead, the wise women and the fortune-tellers and the mediums, working their authority in the one realm the men had not wholly claimed. And now we come to the great shadow that lay across the whole of the Victorian life of meaning, the one that everything else has been circling, for of all the things the Victorians watched and feared and read the signs of, death was the deepest and the nearest, and the omens of death were the most dreaded and the most carefully heeded of all. We have met some of them already in passing: the owl in daylight, the bird at the window, the dog howling in the night, the sparrow on the piano, for so many of the omens we have walked through were at bottom omens of death, the enchanted world forever, straining to give warning of the loss that the Victorians feared above all else, and met so often. But there were death signs beyond these, a whole grim vocabulary by which the approach of the end announced itself to those who knew how to read it. Unhurried. There was the corpse candle, the mysterious light seen moving by night along the road that the funeral would later take, the death light going before to mark the way, feared especially in Wales and the West. There were the 3 knocks, heard at the door or upon the wall, with no one there to make them the death watch, a summons announcing that someone close was passing or about to pass. There was the death watch beetle, ticking in the old timbers of the house, its small sound foretelling a death in the household. There was the smell of roses or of fresh flowers where no flowers were drifting through a room, a sweet and terrible sign that death was coming. There was the picture that fell from the wall of its own accord, the clock that stopped of itself, the mirror that cracked across without a cause, each a herald. There was the sight of yourself in a dream, or the sense of your own double scene, the most personal of warnings, and there was the curious certainty that deaths came in threes, so that 2 deaths in a neighbourhood or a family set everyone watching, in dread, for the 3rd that was sure to follow. Come back to the omens of death once more, for there were 2 among them I passed too lightly, and they are among the most haunting of all, the corpse candle and the death watch. The corpse candle was a light seen by night, a small flame or a glowing globe that moved along the road slowly, at about the height a candle would be carried, travelling from the house where a death was to come to the churchyard where the burial would be, tracing in advance the very path the funeral would later take. It was seen most in Wales and the Western lands, and it was greatly feared, for to see the corpse candle was to know that death was coming, and worse that it was coming to a particular house, the one from which the light set out, and those who saw it would watch in dread to learn who had died. Some said it showed the size of the coming coffin, small for a child, large for a grown soul. It was death announcing its road before it walked it, the light going on ahead to mark the way. And the death watch was a sound, not a light, the small ticking heard in the timbers of an old house in the silence of the night, a sound like the ticking of a watch that foretold a death in the household. It was made, in fact, by a small beetle that bored in old wood and knocked its head against the timber to call its mate, a natural sound with a natural cause, but to the watcher lying awake in the dark beside a sick bed, hearing that small relentless ticking in the wall, it was the very voice of death counting down the hours, the death watch beating out the time the sick one had left. There is something peculiarly chilling in both of these, the silent light on the night road and the small ticking in the dark wall, for they are quiet, patient, certain, death not striking suddenly but announcing itself softly in advance, giving its slow warning, the candle on the road and the watch in the timber, telling the household, in the dark, to make ready, for one of them was going soon. The Victorians lay awake and heard the death watch ticking and knew what it meant, and watched the night road for the corpse candle, and lived, far more than we do, with death not as a distant abstraction, but as a presence that announced itself softly, in the dark, and was always, somewhere near, expected. To live amid all these signs was to live in a kind of constant low watchfulness for the approach of death, and we might think it a morbid way to live, this perpetual reading of the world for omens of the end. But we must set it against the truth of their lives, for death truly was always near to the Victorians, in a way it is not to us, near and sudden and frequent and beyond the reach of any cure, and the omens were, in a way, a means of preparing, of not being taken wholly unawares, of feeling that the great enemy at least announced itself, that the blow did not fall in utter silence. There was even a comfort in it. Strange as that sounds, for a world that gave warning was a world less cruel than one in which death struck from a clear sky with no sign at all, and the corpse candle going before and the 3 knocks at the door, fearful as they were also a kind of mercy, a chance to be ready, a sign that even death moved according to some order that could be known. The Victorians watched for the omens of death because death was their close companion, and they preferred, understandably, to see it coming. Come with me now into the house where death has come gently, with respect, for the Victorians met death with an elaborate tenderness of custom that is among the most striking things about them, and the moment the breath left the body a whole quiet choreography began. The first acts were swift and sure. The clocks were stopped. Every clock in the house halted at the very minute of the death, and there they would stay until after the funeral. The reasons given were several and ran together, that to stop the clock was to mark the moment forever, to show respect, to prevent further misfortune, and, most hauntingly, to let the soul of the newly dead linger a little, not yet hurried on by the ticking passage of time, given a quiet pause before its journey. A house of death was a house where time had stopped, the hands of every clock frozen at the fatal minute, the ticking silenced, an extraordinary stillness laid over the home. Then the mirrors, as we have seen, were covered, every looking-glass draped and hidden, lest the departing soul be caught in the glass, or the living glimpse themselves, and be marked to follow. The curtains were drawn, the blinds lowered, the house darkened and turned inward, and a sign was set upon the door, a wreath of black, and a knot of crape, to tell the street that death had visited, and to ask the passing world for its respect and its quiet. The body itself was tended with care, washed and laid out, often by the women of the family, or a layer-out called for the purpose, dressed in its grave clothes, the eyes closed and weighted with coins, the jaw bound, the hands folded. And it was watched, never left alone, the wake or watch kept by the family through the nights before the burial, sitting with their dead in the darkened clock-stopped house, a vigil of love and of old protective custom both, for the unburied dead must not be left unattended. And then the carrying out, hedged with its own careful observance, for the body must be borne from the house feet first, never head first, so that the dead could not look back into the home and beckon another of the household to follow after. The funeral itself was a great and solemn pageant, especially as the century wore on and the trappings of mourning grew ever more elaborate. The black horses with their black plumes, the mutes standing by the door, the long, slow procession, the whole costly theatre of Victorian death. It is easy to find all this excessive, even morbid, the stopped clocks and the shrouded mirrors and the feet first carrying and the plumed black horses, and the Victorians were indeed reproached, even in their own time, for making too much of death, for an unhealthy dwelling upon it. But there is another way to see it, and a truer one. These were people for whom death was constant and near, and rather than look away from it, as we do, they looked steadily at it, and built around it a structure of custom and ceremony that gave the unbearable a shape, that let grief be expressed and channeled and honoured, that surrounded the terrible fact of loss with meaning and dignity and care. The stopped clock and the covered mirror were not morbid. They were a way of saying that a death mattered, that the household would mark it, that time itself should pause for the passing of a soul, and there is a deep humanity in that which our own hurried and hidden way of death has lost. Stay with me in the house of death a little longer, for there is one custom we passed over too quickly, the watching of the dead, the wake, and it deserves to be felt in its full and solemn tenderness. When a body lay in a Victorian house in the days between the death and the burial, it was not left alone, not for a moment, day or night, but watched over in turn by the family and the neighbours, a vigil kept beside the dead through the long nights until the funeral. There were practical reasons offered, old fears that the dead must be guarded, that something might come to them in the dark, that a cat must be kept from the room. But beneath the old fears lay something gentler and more human, the simple unwillingness to leave the beloved alone, the need to sit with them, to keep them company through the last nights they would spend under the family roof, to not abandon them to the dark and the silence before the earth took them forever. So the watchers sat, through the small hours by the candlelight, beside the still form on the bed, in the clock-stopped, mirror-covered house, and it was a strange and intimate time, sorrowful and yet not without its consolations. The neighbours came to sit and share the watch, to bring food and company, to tell the old stories, even, in some places and some moods, to find a sombre warmth in the gathering, for a death drew a community together round the bereaved. The dead one lay quiet and tended, washed and dressed and laid out with care, surrounded by those who had loved them, watched and companioned to the very end of their time above the ground. We have given all this up, we who send our dead away at once to be tended by strangers in distant rooms, and see them again only briefly, made up, in the funeral parlour. The Victorians kept their dead at home, and washed them with their own hands, and sat with them through the nights, and there was a terror in that closeness to death, no doubt, but there was also a tenderness, a refusal to be parted too soon or too easily, a keeping of company with the beloved through the last dark nights, that our own arrangements, for all their convenience, have quietly taken from us. Let me show you the great business that grew up around Victorian death, for the age made of mourning not only a custom, but an industry, and the trappings of grief could be bought, elaborately and expensively, from shops that existed for nothing else. There were the mourning warehouses, great emporia in the cities devoted entirely to the supplies of grief, where a bereaved family could purchase everything the rituals required, the black gowns and the crepe, the jet jewellery, the black bordered writing paper and handkerchiefs, the mourning bonnets and veils, all of it graded to the stages of mourning and the closeness of the loss. A family struck by death would send to such a place, or be visited by its people, and would be fitted out head to foot in the correct degree of black, for to mourn properly was to mourn visibly and expensively, and the costs of a respectable death could be ruinous. The funeral and the mourning together, swallowing the savings of the poor and straining even the comfortable. For death was among everything else it was, a matter of display, and a family's standing was read in how it buried and mourned its dead. The funeral itself had become, by the height of the age, an elaborate and costly pageant, with its hired mutes standing silent by the door, its black horses with their nodding black plumes, its professional undertakers and their staff, its procession of black carriages, the whole expensive theatre of woe. The poor dreaded above all the pauper's funeral, the burial without ceremony at the parish's expense, and would pay into burial clubs all their lives, scrimping the pennies, to ensure themselves a decent funeral and escape the shame of being buried like a pauper. To be put away properly, with the black plumes and the mourners and the decent stone, mattered enormously, mattered more than almost anything, for it was the last statement a life could make, the final mark of respectability, and people who had little enough in life would beggar themselves to be buried well. There is something at once absurd and deeply moving in this, the vast expense and display lavished upon death, the burial clubs of the poor, the mourning warehouses of the rich, a whole society pouring its resources into the proper marking of its losses, because to mark a death properly was to say that the life had mattered, and that was a thing worth almost any price. Stay with me in the house of mourning a while longer, for the grief of the Victorians did not end with the funeral, but stretched on for months and years, governed by a code of mourning so elaborate and so strict that it became one of the defining features of the age, and at the head of it all stood the Queen herself, for when Prince Albert died, in the winter of 1861, Victoria descended into a grief so deep and so lasting that it shaped the manners of her whole people. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She withdrew from public view into a seclusion that lasted years. She kept Albert's rooms exactly as they had been, his clothes laid out, the water set for his shaving, as though he might return at any moment. The Queen made mourning a way of life, and her people, watching, followed, and the cult of mourning that we think of as so quintessentially Victorian flowed in large part from the widow on the throne and her endless grief. The rules of mourning were intricate and were chiefly the burden of women, who bore the visible weight of the family's grief upon their persons. There were stages, each with its prescribed dress and its prescribed length. Deep or full mourning came first, and for a widow it might last a year and a day or longer, during which she wore unrelieved black, dull black without sheen, her gowns of black crepe, that dull crimped silk that was the very fabric of grief, no jewellery but jet, the black fossil stone, her face veiled in black when she went abroad. Then came second mourning, and then half mourning, through which the strict black was gradually relieved, a little shine permitted, then touches of grey and white, and at last the soft mauves and lilacs of the final stage, the colours of grief fading toward life again. The lengths were laid down for every relation, so long for a husband, so long for a parent, a child, a sibling, down to the distant cousin, and a respectable family moved through these stages with care, for to mourn too little was a scandal and a disrespect to the dead. Let us dwell a little longer on the Queen and her grief, for the story of Victoria and Albert is the great central story of Victorian mourning, and it shaped the manners of a whole people. Theirs had been, by the standards of royal marriages, a true love match, and when Albert died in December of 1861, still a young man, of a fever that better medicine might have saved, the Queen's grief was total, and it never lifted. She was 49 when he died, and she had 40 years yet to live, and she wore black for the whole of them, a widow to the end, her white widow's cap, and her black gowns, the unchanging uniform of her remaining life. She withdrew almost entirely from public view for years, so long and so completely that her people grew restive, that there was grumbling, and even a flicker of republican feeling, a queen who would not be seen, who hid herself in her grief, while the business of the monarchy waited. And she kept Albert present in the most extraordinary ways, refusing the absoluteness of his death. His rooms at the royal residences were kept exactly as he had left them, his clothes laid out fresh each day, hot water brought for the shaving of a man years dead, the rooms tended as shrines, as though he had only stepped out and might at any moment return. She had his likeness everywhere, slept with his photograph above her, had casts made of his hand to hold. She mourned him with the whole force of a powerful and passionate nature, publicly, unashamedly, for 4 decades, and in doing so she gave her people, who already lived close to death, and already mourned elaborately, a kind of permission and a kind of model, the highest lady in the land, showing that grief might be total and lifelong and worn openly as a black gown. The cult of mourning that we think of as so Victorian had many roots, but one of the deepest was the widow at Windsor, faithful to her dead husband for 40 years, and her long sorrow lay over the whole later half of the age like a shadow, or like a kind of sombre blessing upon the grief of everyone else. It was a heavy burden, this code of grief, expensive and confining and falling hardest on women who might pass great stretches of their lives swathed in black for one relation after another, and it has been criticised, then and since, as a tyranny of custom, a making of grief into a performance and a fashion. And there is truth in that. But there is also something to be said for it, something we have perhaps lost. The Victorian code of mourning gave grief a recognised place and a recognised time. It told the bereaved that their loss was real and would be honoured, that they need not pretend to be well before they were, that the world would make allowance for them, and expect nothing of them while the black was worn. It made grief visible, so that a widow in her weeds was known at a glance to be a woman in sorrow, to be treated gently, and it gave her a path through the wilderness of mourning, a set of stages to pass through, a structure to hold to when the ground had fallen away beneath her. We send people back to work in a week now and expect them to smile, and there are those who would say the Victorians, with their years of black and their stages of grief, understood something about sorrow that we have carelessly forgotten. Let me tell you of jet, the black stone of mourning, for in it the whole sombre beauty of Victorian grief is caught in a single material. Jet is not truly a stone, but a kind of fossilized wood, deep black, light in the hand, that can be carved and polished to a soft dark gleam, and it became in the mourning age the one jewellery a woman in deep grief was permitted to wear. In full mourning all brightness was forbidden, all shine and colour and sparkle, for jewellery that glittered was unseemly in sorrow, and so the bereaved wore jet black and grave and unshining, brooches and beads and earrings and lockets carved from the dark fossil wood, the only ornament that grief allowed. The town where the best jet was found and worked grew prosperous on the trade, its carvers turning out the mourning jewellery that a whole nation in black demanded, and a piece of good jet, carved with a flower or a clasped hand or set with a lock of the dead one's hair, was a treasured thing, worn through the long stages of grief. And jet was only the chief of the mourning ornaments, for grief had its whole jewellery, sombre and meaningful. There were the brooches and rings of black enamel and gold, inscribed with the name and dates of the dead, in memory of the words that turned an ornament into a memorial. There were the lockets holding the woven hair, or the tiny photograph of the lost face. There were rings made to hold a curl of hair beneath a crystal, worn always, that dead carried on the living hand. All of it was beautiful in its dark way, and all of it was meaningful, every piece a remembrance, a carrying of the dead, a wearing of grief made visible and lasting. We have nothing quite like it now, we who do not wear our grief, who have no special jewellery of mourning, who would find it strange to carry a dead one's hair in a ring upon our finger. But there is a tenderness in it we might envy, the grief made into something to wear and keep, the dark jet and the woven hair and the inscribed gold, the beloved dead kept close and carried, their memory worn over the heart, in a world that knew how to honour sorrow, and was not ashamed, as we somehow are, to let it show. Let me show you now one of the most tender and most startling of the Victorian ways of grief, the keeping of the dead close through the things they left behind, through hair and through photograph, and through the small treasured relics of a vanished life. The Victorians could not bear to let their dead go entirely, and they found ways to hold on to something of them, and chief among these was the working of hair. The hair of the dead, cut as a keepsake before burial, was woven and braided, and worked into the most intricate objects, into brooches and rings and bracelets and lockets, into elaborate wreaths and pictures framed and hung upon the wall. Hair work was a real and skilled craft, and a piece of mourning jewellery containing the hair of a lost husband or child or parent was a thing of great preciousness, worn against the body, a literal piece of the beloved dead kept close, their very hair, which does not decay, woven into a flower or a knot and set in gold and worn over the heart. And then there was the photograph, for the camera came of age in the Victorian century, and it gave the bereaved something they had never had before, a true and exact likeness of the face that was gone. The early photograph was costly and slow, and many a humble family had no picture of a loved one until that loved one died. And then, in their grief, they would call the photographer to take the one image they would ever possess, the post-mortem photograph, the dead posed as if sleeping, or even as if living, dressed and arranged with terrible care, the eyes sometimes painted open upon the closed lids, the child laid as if asleep among flowers, the family gathered around. These images strike us now as macabre, even unbearable, and we must understand them rightly, for they were made in love, not in morbidity. For a poor family, the post-mortem photograph might be the only likeness of a dead child that would ever exist, the single image to be treasured down all the years, the one face to remember them by, and the calling of the photographer to the house of death was an act of desperate tenderness, a snatching of one lasting image from the jaws of total loss. Consider the photograph a moment longer, and what the coming of the camera meant in a world so haunted by the wish to keep the dead, for the camera changed everything, and the spirit photograph was only the strangest fruit of it. Before the camera, an ordinary family had no true likeness of its members at all, nothing but memory, and for the wealthy few, a painted portrait. When someone died, their face began at once to fade from the minds of those who loved them, the exact look of them slipping away year by year, until even the beloved could not quite call it up, the cruelest of the second losses that follow a death, the losing of the very face. And then the camera came, in the middle of the century, and for the first time ordinary people could possess an exact and faithful image of those they loved, the real face caught and held, proof against the fading of memory, and it was a wonder, a marvel, a comfort beyond reckoning to a people who had never had such a thing. No wonder then that they photographed their dead, that the post-mortem portrait was made in such tenderness and treasured so, for to a family that might have no other likeness, the photograph of the dead child, laid as if sleeping, was the one face that would remain when memory failed, the single window left open onto a face that would otherwise be lost forever. And no wonder that when the spirit photograph appeared with its faint figure at the shoulder, the bereaved longed to believe it, for the camera had already shown itself a keeper of faces, a defeater of loss, a machine that held what death tried to take, and to believe it could hold even the spirit of the dead, could photograph the very ghost at the mourner's side, was only one step further into the wish the camera already answered. The whole strange business of Victorian death photography, the sleeping dead and the spirit at the shoulder, grew from this, from the new and miraculous power to keep a face, and from the oldest wish there is, the wish not to lose the look of the beloved, not to let their face fade, to keep them, somehow, against the dark, even if only in a fading image on a square of card, even if only as a faint shape that longing and the darkroom together had conjured at the mourner's side. All of it, the hair work and the mourning jewellery and the photograph of the dead, speaks of a love that would not simply surrender its beloved to the grave and to forgetting, that reached for every means of keeping something, some token, some likeness, some literal physical piece, against the unbearable completeness of death. We do something of the same, in our way, keeping our photographs, our small treasured objects of the dead, though we have lost the hairwork and the post-mortem portrait, and would shrink from them now. But the impulse is the same impulse, the oldest there is, the refusal of the loving heart to let go entirely, the need to keep the dead somehow present, somehow close, somehow not wholly gone. The Victorians simply pursued that need further and more openly than we do, with the lock of hair woven into a ring and the photograph of the sleeping child holding their dead close in the only ways they could. And there's nothing morbid in it when you see it truly, only love, only the long ache of love refusing to be parted from what it loved. Off. Let your mind drift now, gently, away from any single custom and over the whole shape of a Victorian life, for the world of belief did not visit only at the great moments, but accompanied a person from the cradle to the grave, threaded through every stage of the journey. Think of it as a single life unrolling. The child is born, and the caul is saved, and the coral is hung, and the baby is carried upward before it is carried down, and the day of its birth is read for its character. The child grows, learning the rhymes without knowing they are charms, chanting "see a pin and pick it up," counting the magpies, fearing the cracks in the pavement, living in the bright simple magic of childhood that is the enchanted age in miniature. The young person comes to love and works the divinations, sleeps with the cake beneath the pillow, peers into the Halloween mirror, reads the future in the apple peel, asking the great question of whom they will marry. The marriage comes, with its something old and something blue, its threshold carried over, its omens read. The household is set up and kept, warded at its thresholds, its fire watched, its salt guarded, the children come, and the cycle begins again. And always, drawing nearer, there is the other end of the journey, the death that the whole enchanted world circled and dreaded and prepared for. The omens gather, the bird at the window, the stopped clock, the dog in the night. The death comes and the clocks are stilled, and the mirrors covered, and the bees told, and the body watched and borne out feet first, and the long black ritual of mourning begins. And even beyond the grave the enchantment continues, in the hair woven into the locket, the photograph treasured, the seance sought, the longing reaching after the departed soul into the dark. From the saved caul to the woven hair, from the birth rhyme to the death omen, a single Victorian life was companioned the whole way by this realm of signs and charms and meanings, never alone, never merely at the mercy of blind chance, but watched over, warned, protected, and mourned by an universe felt to be alive with significance at every step of the road from the cradle to the grave, and beyond it, let that whole long companioned journey settle in your mind as you lie there, the enchanted life unrolling from its first breath to its last and past it, every stage of it lit by meaning. And now we come to the thing I promised you at the very start of the evening, the darkened parlour and the ring of joined hands. For out of all this nearness to death, all this love that would not let the dead go, there grew the most remarkable movement of the whole Victorian world of signs, the great wave of spiritualism, the belief that the living could speak directly with the dead. It began, as such things often do, in a small and almost absurd way, in America, in the middle of the century, when two young sisters in a farmhouse claimed to communicate with a spirit through mysterious rapping sounds, knocks that answered questions, but one for yes, two for no. From that small beginning the thing spread like fire, across America and then across the Atlantic to Britain, where it arrived in the 1850s and found a people extraordinarily ready to receive it. Within a few years there were mediums in every city, spiritualist societies and newspapers and circles, public lectures and private sittings, a whole movement claiming that death was not a wall but a door, and that the door could be opened. Why did it take such hold, this strange new faith, among the clever and the educated as much as the simple? The answer lies in everything we have spoken of tonight. Here was an age soaked in grief, living close to constant death, burying its children, longing beyond all longing for some assurance that the dead were not gone, not lost, not silent forever, but only departed a little way, and reachable. And here, at the same time, was an age whose old religious certainties were being shaken by science, by the new geology and the new biology, by doubt, so that many found the comforts of the old faith slipping even as their need for comfort grew. Into that aching gap spiritualism stepped, and it offered not the distant promise of a heaven to be reached by faith alone, but something far more immediate and astonishing, proof, contact, the actual voice of the actual beloved dead, here, tonight, in this room, rapping on this table, speaking through this medium. It offered to turn the hope of the afterlife into evidence, and to a grieving and doubting age that offer was almost irresistible. We should pause on why the age was so ready for the seance, for it is not enough to say the Victorians grieved, since all ages grieve, and we must understand what was particular to theirs. Two things came together in the middle of the century with a peculiar force. The first was the sheer scale and nearness of death, which we have spoken of, the children carried off, the diseases without cure, but the ordinary constant presence of mortality in every family. The second was newer and stranger, the slow shaking of the old religious certainties by the advance of knowledge. For these were the very years when the new science was unsettling the ground beneath the old faith, when the geologists were reading in the rocks a history of the earth far longer than the scriptures allowed, when the students of life were proposing that the species, man among them, had risen by slow natural descent rather than by special creation, when the whole comfortable old picture of a world made and watched over by a loving God was, for many thoughtful people, beginning to crack. And here was the agony of it, that the old faith was weakening at the very moment the need for it was as sharp as ever, that people were losing their certainty of heaven, just as they stood beside the graves of their children and needed that certainty most. Into that terrible gap between the failing of the old comfort and the undiminished need for comfort, spiritualism stepped, and we can see now why it was so welcome. For it offered to do what the shaken old faith no longer surely could, to prove the afterlife, not promise it but prove it, to show by evidence, by rapping and writing and materialization, that the dead survived, that the grave was not the end, that the lost children were not lost but waiting, reachable, only just beyond the turned-down lamp. It promised to put the comfort of religion on the new footing of evidence that the age demanded, to give the grieving and the doubting both what they needed. The assurance of survival proved as a fact, that it could not really deliver this, that the proofs were fraud and self-deception, mattered less than that it tried, that it spoke to the exact wound of the age, the doubt and the grief together, and offered, to a people losing heaven just when they could least afford to, a way to believe again. It is worth knowing how the whole great wave began. for the origin of spiritualism is almost comically small set against the vastness of what grew from it. It started in 1848 in a small wooden farmhouse in New York State with two young sisters, Maggie and Kate Fox, girls of 14 or so, who began to report mysterious knocking sounds in the house, raps that seemed to come from no natural source. The girls, it was said, found they could communicate with whatever made the raps, asking it questions and receiving answers, one knock for no, two for yes, the raps spelling out, through a code, that the sounds came from the spirit of a murdered man buried beneath the house. The story spread, the sisters became famous, and from that small and dubious beginning the belief caught and ran across America and then the world, until within a few years millions believed that the dead could rap out their messages to the living, and the seance, born in a farmhouse bedroom, had become a worldwide movement. And here is the bitter end of that beginning, the detail the believers found hardest to bear. 40 years later, in 1888, one of the Fox sisters, Maggie, stood up before a great audience and confessed that it had all been a fraud, and showed them how it was done, for the raps, she revealed, were made by the girls themselves, by cracking the joints of their toes and knees, a sharp, clean sound in a quiet room that seemed, to the wishful listener, to come from the very air or the very walls. The whole vast edifice of spiritualism, she declared, had grown from the toe-cracking of two bored children who had started it as a prank and been swept up by it beyond any power to stop. And yet, and this is the truly remarkable thing, the confession changed almost nothing. The movement was far too large by then, far too deeply rooted in the needs it answered, to be brought down by the confession of its founders. Believers explained the confession away, said she had been pressured, or paid, or had lost her own powers. The séances went on. The need went on, for the thing had never really been about the Fox sisters or their toes at all. It had been about grief and longing and the unbearable silence of the dead, and no confession could touch that, because the toe-cracking had only ever been the spark, and the longing was the fire. The medium stood at the centre of it, very often a woman, for spiritualism opened to women a kind of authority and a kind of public voice that almost nothing else in the Victorian world allowed them, the medium being the sensitive vessel through whom the spirit spoke, passive and receptive, and yet, in the séance room, powerful, the focus of all attention, the gateway to the other world. Some mediums sat privately, for a fee, receiving the bereaved who came longing to reach a lost husband or child. Some performed publicly before great audiences in displays of spirit communication that were part religion and part theatre, and some moved in the highest circles, for the fascination reached everywhere, into the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, into the studies of scientists, even, it was whispered, toward the throne, and across the ocean into the White House itself, where a grieving Mary Todd Lincoln, who had buried her sons, held séances and sought to reach her dead. The longing crossed every line of class and learning, for grief crosses every line, and wherever there were people who had lost what they loved and could not bear it, there spiritualism found its believers. Now let me tell you about the most celebrated medium of the whole age, for if we are to understand the séance we should know the figure who made it famous, and his name was Daniel Douglas Home. He was a Scotsman, raised partly in America, who came to Britain in the 1850s, and rose to a fame and a respectability that no other medium ever quite matched, moving in the highest circles received by royalty and aristocracy across Europe, the darling of a society mad for the marvellous. What set Home apart, and what so baffled his many enemies, was that in a career of decades he was never once caught in fraud, never exposed, never detected in a trick, a record so unlike that of nearly every other medium that it has puzzled investigators ever since. His seances were astonishing. Tables rose into the air. Accordions played, untouched, held in one hand or floating free. Spirit hands appeared and touched the sitters. He was seen, it was said, to handle burning coals from the fire without harm, and to grow longer, to stretch, but before the eyes of his witnesses. And there was the most famous marvel of all, the great levitation which took place, the story goes, on a winter's night in 1868 at a house in Westminster, before 3 respectable witnesses. Home, it was reported, went into a trance and rose from the floor and floated out of the window of one room, 3 stories above the street, and in again through the window of another, drifting through the night air high above the ground and returning safely to the company. The witnesses swore to it. The doubters scoffed and offered their explanations. A narrow ledge, a darkened room, the suggestible minds of believers, the difficulty any of us has in saying afterward exactly what we saw in poor light and high excitement. No one has ever fully explained the levitation of Daniel Home, and no one ever caught him cheating, and he remains the great enigma of Victorian spiritualism, the medium who was never exposed, whose marvels were witnessed by sober and intelligent people who could not account for them, and who stands to this day as the single hardest case for the skeptic to dismiss, the one who got clean away. Come into the seance room with me now, into the very heart of it, for this is the place the whole evening has been travelling toward, and I want you to sit in the circle and feel how it was. It is evening, of course, always evening, the curtains drawn, the room prepared. A small company has gathered, a handful of people seated close around a table, some of them strangers to one another, drawn here by the same deep hope, each carrying a private grief, a name they long to hear, a face they cannot stop seeing. The medium takes her place among them. The lamp is turned down low, lower, until the room is in near darkness, for the spirits, it is said, do not come into the light, and the faces around the table become pale shapes in the gloom, the only brightness the last red glow of the fire. The company is asked to join hands upon the table, to form the unbroken circle through which the spirit power may flow, and so they sit, hands linked, in the hush and the dark, waiting, the silence stretching, every sense strained toward the unseen. And then it begins. A rap, sharp and distinct, sounds from the heart of the table, from nowhere, from the wood itself. Another. The medium speaks, asking if a spirit is present, and the raps answer, one for yes, and a current of awe and terror and longing passes around the circle. The table itself begins to move, to tilt and tip beneath their resting hands, to rock and shudder and lift, as though some force had entered it, and the medium asks her questions, and the table answers, tilting once for yes, twice for no, or rapping out the letters of the alphabet, one slow knock at a time to spell a word, a name, a message. Sometimes there is more. The cold breath of air moves through the closed room. A bell laid on the table rings untouched. A hand, cold and soft, brushes a sitter's cheek in the dark. A faint light drifts above the table. A voice, not quite the medium's, speaks a name. And to the one who came longing for that name, who hears it spoken now out of the darkness in a voice they almost recognize, the effect is overwhelming beyond any describing, for the wall between the living and the dead seems to have grown thin, seems to have parted, and the beloved seems, for one shattering moment, to be there, present, reaching back across the dark. There were tools and instruments to the work, beyond the rapping table. There was the planchette, the little heart-shaped board on wheels with a pencil set in it, on which the sitters rested their fingers and which moved seemingly of itself to write out messages from the dead, the ancestor of the Ouija board that came later. There was automatic writing, the medium's hand moving across the page guided. She said, by a spirit not her own pouring out letters and messages from beyond. There was the trumpet through which the spirit voices were said to speak, the slate on which spirit writing appeared, the cabinet from which in the most dramatic seances the medium claimed to summon the full materialized form of a spirit, a figure draped in white stepping out of the dark. Much of this we will come to, invited fraud, and often was fraud. But sit for a moment longer in that dark circle before we step back and weigh it, and feel what the believers felt, the joined hands, the held breath, the rap from the silent table, the name spoken from the dark, and the wild leap of the grieving heart that cried, against all reason, against all doubt, you are there, you are not lost, I have found you again across the very gulf of death. Come back with me to the seance room, for there is more to see there than the rapping table, and the materializing mediums produced wonders, stranger and more unsettling than any knock. There was the matter of ectoplasm, that strange substance the mediums claimed to exude in the depths of trance, a pale, faintly luminous stuff that was said to issue from the body of the medium, from the mouth or the nose or the hands, and to form itself into shapes, into faces, into limbs, even into the full figures of the dead. In the dim light of the seance room, the sitters would see this pale matter gathering, drifting, taking form, and would believe they watched the very stuff of the spirit world made briefly visible, the bridge by which the dead clothed themselves in seeming flesh. It was, when it was examined, which was rarely permitted, very often cheesecloth or muslin, or worse, swallowed and regurgitated, soaked in luminous paint, the crudest of physical frauds dressed in the language of the marvellous. And yet in the dark, to the willing eye, it was the substance of heaven, the dead made manifest, and the sitters wept to see it. Then there was the planchette, and its descendant the talking board, the instruments by which the spirits were said to write. The planchette was a small heart-shaped platform on little wheels, with a pencil fixed through it, and the sitters would rest their fingertips lightly upon it, and it would move, seemingly of its own accord, dragging the pencil across the paper to write out words and messages from beyond. Later came the lettered board, the alphabet laid out with its yes and its no, over which a pointer moved under the sitter's fingers, spelling out the spirit's replies, the board we know now by a trade name and still, some of us, half fear to touch. The hands that rested on the planchette swore they did not move it, felt it move beneath them with a will not their own, and perhaps believed it. For the mind can move the muscles without the knowledge of the conscious self, and the messages welled up from somewhere, from the deep places of the sitters' own minds, if not from the dead, and spelled themselves out letter by letter in the dim and breathless room. Marvel or self-deception or fraud, the instruments of the seance gave the longing a voice, let the dead seem to write and speak, and to the grieving hand resting on the moving board, the message that came was the message it most wished to hear. And here is a story stranger still, the strangest perhaps in all the annals of the seance, the story of Florence Cook, and the spirit she called Katie King, for it draws together everything, the marvel and the fraud and the longing and the learned man who staked his name upon it. Florence Cook was a young London woman, scarcely more than a girl, who in the early 1870s achieved what no English medium had achieved before, the full materialization of a spirit, a complete human form, stepping out of the dark to walk among the sitters. She would be bound with ropes and shut behind a curtain in a cabinet, and from it into the dim seance room would step Katie King, a young woman in white, who walked and spoke and touched the sitters, who let herself be looked at, and even, on occasion, weighed and measured, who held a baby, who seemed in every way a living woman, and who was, the believers insisted, a spirit of the dead made flesh before their eyes. The man who championed her was no fool and no obvious dupe, but one of the most distinguished scientists of the age, William Crookes, a chemist and physicist of real eminence, the discoverer of a chemical element, the inventor of instruments that bear his name to this day. Crookes investigated Florence Cook in his own home, under what he insisted were rigorous conditions, and he came away convinced and published his conviction, declaring Katie King a genuine materialized spirit, to the astonishment and ridicule of the scientific world. How a man of his gifts came to believe it has been argued over ever since, whether he was deceived by a clever girl, or blinded by his own desire to believe, or caught in some entanglement he could not honourably escape, or whether, just possibly, he saw something that none of our explanations can account for. The seance is ended. Katie King bade her famous tearful farewell, and Florence Cook's reputation, after a man lunged out of the dark at one sitting, and seized the spirit and found it solid and struggling, and very like Florence herself, never fully recovered. Crookes turned back to his physics and rarely spoke of it again, and the case sits there still, unresolved. A young woman, a great scientist, a spirit in white, and a question that has never been fully answered, the very emblem of an age caught between its wonder and its doubt. Let us step now, with me, into the strange and haunting business of spirit photography for the camera, that new and seemingly truthful machine, was drawn into the spiritualist world and produced some of its most uncanny and most poignant artifacts. It began in America in the early 1860s, when a photographer found, or claimed to find, that his portraits sometimes showed, beside the living sitter, a second figure, faint and transparent, a face hovering at the shoulder, the likeness, it was said, of a spirit of the dead. The spirit photograph was born, and it offered something the seance could not, something tangible, something to hold in the hand and keep, an actual image made by the impartial machine of the living and the dead together in one frame. To a bereaved mother, it offered the unbearable, beautiful possibility of a photograph of herself, with her lost child once more at her side, faint and ghostly, but there, captured, kept. The most famous of these photographers produced image after image of grieving sitters accompanied by their transparent dead, and the most famous single example shows the widowed Mary Todd Lincoln seated and rising behind her, his hands resting gently upon her shoulders, the unmistakable shadowy figure of her assassinated husband, the murdered president, come back in the photograph to stand by his grieving wife. To look at that image, even now, knowing all that we know, is to feel the pull of it, the terrible longing it answered, the comfort it offered to a woman drowned in grief. And that is the thing we must hold on to as we turn now to the matter of fraud, for spirit photography was, almost certainly, in nearly every case a trick, produced by double exposure, by the faint printing of a second image upon the plate, a known and simple photographic technique turned to the manufacture of ghosts. The photographer who made the Lincoln image was in fact tried for fraud, and the methods were exposed, and the transparent spirits were shown to be, in all likelihood, the productions of the darkroom rather than the dead. And yet the comfort those images gave was real, whatever their making, and the longing they answered was real, and the people who bought them and wept over them and treasured them were not fools but mourners, reaching for the one thing they wanted more than anything in the world, one more sight of the face they had lost. There is a deep and difficult truth tangled up in the spirit photograph, that something can be false in its making and true in its meaning, that a fraud can answer a real need, that the grieving heart will find comfort even in an image it half suspects, and cling to it, because the alternative, the total and final absence of the beloved, is simply unbearable. We may judge the photographers who profited from grief, and many deserve judging. But we cannot so easily judge the mourners, and we should not, for there is not one of us who, having lost what we loved beyond saving, would not feel the pull of that faint figure at our shoulder, would not want, against all our reason, to believe that the camera had caught what the heart could not let go. Now, in fairness, for the age itself was divided, and we should be too, let us turn to the doubters, for not every Victorian was swept up in the seance and the spirit photograph, and some of the sharpest minds of the age set themselves to test these wonders and to expose them, and the struggle between the believers and the doubters was one of the great dramas of the time. The frauds were many and real. The darkened room that the spirits required was also, conveniently, the room in which trickery could not be seen. Mediums were caught again and again with the apparatus of deception, the hidden rods that tipped the tables, the gauze and the muslin that made the materialized spirits, the confederates who supplied the knowledge the medium seemed to pluck from the air, the three hand that rang the bell and brushed the cheek, while the sitters believed both the medium's hands were held. Investigators slipped into seances and seized the spirit in the dark, and found it to be the medium in a draped sheet. The methods were exposed in pamphlets and lectures, and the whole movement was shadowed always by the steady drumbeat of detection and disgrace. Among the doubters were the conjurers, the professional magicians, and they made formidable enemies of the mediums, for they knew, as the scientists and the grieving did not, exactly how an effect might be faked, how a thing might be made to seem to happen that did not happen. The great stage magicians could reproduce every wonder of the seance room by purely natural means. The raps, the floating table, the spirit writing, the materialized form, and having reproduced them, they would explain them, showing the public how the trick was done, and they pursued the fraudulent mediums with a particular zeal, for they regarded them as conjurers who lied about their conjuring, who took the honest tricks of the magician's trade and used them to prey upon the grief of the bereaved. The most famous of these magician investigators in a later generation made the exposure of fraudulent mediums almost a personal crusade, and alongside the conjurers stood the men of science, who formed societies for the careful investigation of these claims, who sat in on seances with notebooks and instruments, determined to test whether any of it was real, and who found, for the most part, fraud and self-deception, though a few, to their own surprise, came away believing, or at least unable wholly to dismiss what they had seen. It is worth telling you of two famous men who stood on opposite sides of the great question, for their long quarrel in a slightly later day catches the whole division of the age in two figures. One was a great writer, the creator of the most rational detective in all of fiction, a man whose most famous character solved every mystery by pure cold reason and the observation of small facts. And yet this same writer became in his own life the most fervent and famous believer in spiritualism of his generation, convinced utterly that the dead spoke, that the spirits were real, that the seance opened a true door, a conviction deepened by his own griefs, the son and the brother he lost, and held against all ridicule to the end of his days. He toured the world preaching the spiritualist faith, spent his fortune and his fame upon it, believed in the fairies of a famous photograph that fooled almost no one else, the great rationalist of fiction become, in life, the best believer. The other was a magician, the most famous escape artist the world had ever seen, a man who knew, as few did, exactly how an impossible-seeming thing might be faked, for faking the impossible was his whole art and trade, and he made it his mission, in his later years, to expose the fraudulent mediums, to attend their seances in disguise and catch them at their tricks, to reproduce on the public stage every marvel of the seance room by purely natural means, and then explain it, to defend the grieving public from those who preyed upon their sorrow. His own grief drove him, the loss of his beloved mother, and his fury that mediums claimed to bring her false messages, and he pursued them relentlessly. The great magician turned the great debunker. The two men, the believing writer and the doubting magician, were for a time friends, and their friendship broke upon exactly this rock. The one certain the dead spoke, and the other certain it was all a cruel trick, and they ended as bitter opponents, the believer and the skeptic, each driven by his own love and his own loss to opposite conclusions about the same dark room. They are the whole age in two figures, the longing and the doubt, the open heart and the sharp eye, and the quarrel between them has never really ended, for it is the quarrel still going on, quietly, in every one of us. And that division, running right through the heart of the age and even through the minds of individual people, is the truest picture we can leave you with of the Victorian and the unseen, for it was not a simple matter of a credulous age that believed everything. It was a divided age, a questioning age, an age arguing fiercely with itself about the boundary between the real and the longed for. Brilliant people on both sides, and many caught uncertainly in the middle, wanting to believe and fearing to be fooled, drawn by the comfort and repelled by the fraud. There were convinced believers who staked their reputations on the reality of the spirits. There were fierce debunkers who exposed trick after trick, and there were vast numbers in between. The ordinary Victorians who went to a seance once and came away not knowing what to think, who half believed, who hoped and doubted in the same breath, who kept a spirit photograph in a drawer and were not sure themselves whether they thought it real. The enchanted world was not a settled thing the Victorians simply inhabited. It was a question they lived inside and argued over and never resolved, exactly as in our own way we never have either. Let us be fair to the seance and to the comfort it gave, for it is too easy, knowing the fraud, to see only the cheats and the dupes, and to miss the real human good that was sometimes done in those dim rooms. Set aside for a moment the question of whether the dead truly spoke. Think only of the grieving mother who had buried her child, who could not eat or sleep for the weight of her loss, who felt she would go mad with the silence where the child's voice had been, and who came at last, in her desperation, to a seance, and sat in the circle and heard, in the dark, a message addressed to her, the child's name, a few words of love, an assurance that the little one was safe and happy and waiting. We may be certain the message was no true voice from beyond, that it came from the medium's craft and the mother's longing, and yet the mother went home eased, able to sleep, able to bear her days, carrying the comfort of those few words like a warmth in her breast. And who is to say that comfort was worthless because its source was false? This is the hardest knot in the whole matter, and we should not pretend to untie it too easily. There was real fraud and real exploitation, mediums who grew rich on the grief of the bereaved, who told them lies for money, and there is no defending that. And there was also real comfort, grief eased, despair held off, the unbearable made bearable by those same lies, and that comfort was not nothing to the ones who received it. The seance was a cruel deception and a genuine mercy, both at once, depending on where you stood and what you needed, and most of those who sought it were not fools to be mocked, but mourners to be pitied, people in the depths of a grief we can only hope never to know, reaching for the one thing that might ease it, the sense that the beloved was not wholly gone. We need not believe a word of spiritualism to understand why they reached for it, and to feel, across all the years and all our knowing, deep compassion for the grieving heart that sat in the dark circle and longed to hear a lost voice, and heard it, and was, for a little while, comforted. Let your mind rest now, gently, on the simple picture of a Victorian evening, for it is the cradle of so much that we have spoken of, and there is a deep peace in it to carry toward sleep. The day is done. The curtains are drawn against the dark and the cold. The lamps are lit, the soft yellow light pooling on the table, and the faces around it. And the fire burns in the grate, the living heart of the room, shifting and glowing. The family is gathered, as families gathered then, with nowhere else to be, and no glowing screens to scatter them, drawn together into the one warm-lit room at the centre of the dark house. There is needlework, perhaps, and reading aloud, and quiet talk, and the cards or the tea things, and the long, unhurried hours of an evening that has nothing to fill it but itself. And around them, unnoticed, taken for granted, the whole lost enchantment keeps its quiet watch, the fire sending its small messages, the flowers on the table speaking their silent language, the mirror waiting above the mantel, the salt in its cellar, the clock ticking that will one day be stopped. It was in such evenings around such fires that the realm of meaning was kept alive and handed on, for it was here that the stories were told, the ghost stories especially as the nights drew in toward Christmas, the old tales of omens and warnings and the returning dead, passed from the old to the young in the firelight. It was here that the grandmother turned the teacup and read the leaves, that the children learned the rhymes, that the customs were performed and absorbed below the level of thought. The enchanted world lived in the ordinary evening, in the warmth and the lamplight and the gathered family, handed down by the fireside from one generation to the next, the whole vast inheritance of belief passing quietly from grandmother to grandchild in the soft hours before bed. Let that warm-lit room hold you now as you drift towards sleep, the drawn curtains, the glowing fire, the gathered family, the quiet hours and all around them, patient and unnoticed, the old belief keeping its watch as it kept watch over them, through all the long Victorian evenings, in the warm rooms at the heart of the dark. And so, as the evening draws toward its close, let us stand back and look at the whole of this enchanted age we have walked through, and ask the question that has been waiting under everything, which is simply, why? Why did they believe, these clever, capable modern people, in their omens and their charms, their covered mirrors, and their wrapping tables, their language of flowers and their photographs of the dead? We have circled the answer all evening, and now we can name it plainly, and it is not that they were foolish, for they were not, and it is not that they were primitive, for they built our modern world. It is that they lived close to the two great mysteries that we have learned to keep at arm's length, the mystery of chance and the mystery of death, and they reached, as the human heart always reaches, for meaning in the face of them. Let your mind walk the whole turning year now, gently, for the older world moved with the seasons, and to follow it round the year is a quiet way to hold the whole of it as you drift towards sleep. Begin in the deep midwinter, at Christmas, the haunted warm heart of the year, the ghost stories by the fire, the greenery brought in, the old dark powers stirring under the festival's bright surface, the year turning at its lowest point in the cold and the dark. Move into the new year, and the first footing at the threshold, the dark man with his coal and bread, the luck of the whole year decided at the door in the first minutes after midnight. Come into the spring, and the May dew gathered at dawn for beauty, the blossom that must not be brought indoors lest it bring death, the world waking, and the old fears of the waking year. Into the high summer, and midsummer eve with its old magic, its divinations, its bonfires, the shortest night when strange things walked, and on into the autumn, the year beginning to die, the harvest gathered with its own old customs, the last sheaf and its meanings, to Halloween, the great night of the thinning veil, the apple peel and the mirror, and the dead drawing near, and round again through the dying of the year, the falling leaves, the early dark, back to the midwinter, and the Christmas fire, and the ghost stories, the wheel come full circle. The Victorians lived inside this turning year of meaning, every season with its customs, every festival with its magic, the calendar, not a blank grid of dates, but a living wheel of significance turning through the light and the dark, and they moved around it year by year, marking each turning, keeping each custom companioned all the way round by the old beliefs. Let that turning wheel carry you down towards sleep now, the warm Christmas fire and the New Year's threshold and the May dew and the midsummer flame and the Halloween mirror, round and round through the seasons of the enchanted year, the whole bright and shadowed wheel of it, turning gently in the dark. There is one more thread to gather before we let the evening close. The rhymes, for so much of this age of signs was carried in rhyme, in the small verses that fixed the beliefs in the memory and handed them down. And the rhymes are perhaps the most enduring relic of all, for they outlived the belief and survive in the mouths of children who have no idea what they once meant. There was the magpie rhyme, one for sorrow. There was the rhyme of the wedding day. Married in white you have chosen right. Married in black you will wish yourself back. A colour for every fortune. There was the rhyme of the days for the cutting of the nails and the rhyme of the child's birthday. Monday's child is fair of face, that we still recite over the cradle, without a thought for the old fortune-telling in it. There was see a pin and pick it up. There was the rhyme for the new moon, and for the falling star to wish upon, and for the ladybird to send home to her burning house, and 100 more, the small verses of the folk world, sing-song, easily remembered, easily passed on. And that is how an enchanted world survives in the end, not in grand doctrines, but in small rhymes, in the things children chant and grandmothers say, in the touchwood and the cross your fingers and the bless you when you sneeze, the sneeze that once was thought to expel a spirit or risk the escape of the soul. We carry these fragments still, all of us, the rhymes and the small gestures and the half-beliefs, worn smooth by use, their meanings forgotten, and through them the lost enchantment reaches into our own disenchanted lives, a buried inheritance we cannot quite be rid of. When we wish on a star, or avoid walking under a ladder, or say touch wood, or feel that flicker at a broken mirror, you are speaking the old language, carrying the old beliefs, a Victorian almost for a moment, and an ancient before that, joined by these small surviving things to the whole long line of people who lived in the world of meaning, and could not quite leave it, and neither quite can we. Think of what their lives were. Death was everywhere among them, and could not be cured, and it took their children most of all, the small graves filling the churchyards, the empty cradles, a grief so common and so constant that almost every family knew it. Misfortune fell without warning and without remedy. The fever, the accident, the ruin, the slow disease, and there was so little anyone could do. They lived, far more nakedly than we do, at the mercy of forces they could not control, and in the face of that helplessness they did what human beings have always done. They looked for signs, they performed their small protective rituals, they sought for some thread of meaning running through the chaos, some sense that the world was not blind, that the dead were not gone, that something could be read and something could be done. The charm against the curse the omen heeded, the clock stopped at the moment of death, the hand reached across the seance table, all of it was the same deep human act, the act of refusing to believe that we are alone and helpless in an indifferent universe, the act of insisting that there is meaning and connection and hope. Let us think, before the end, about what it actually felt like to live inside this world, from the inside, in the nerves and the heart. For we have catalogued the beliefs, but not quite inhabited them. To live in the enchanted world was to live in a state of heightened attention, a constant low alertness to the messages of things, and it had two faces, and we should feel them both. There was the anxiety of it, the unending watchfulness, the small dreads, the salt spilled and the mirror cracked and the bird at the window, the sense that misfortune was always near and forever, signalling its approach, that one must be careful observant, ready, that the life was full of tripwires and warnings. It could be wearing, this, a low chronic unease, a life hedged with prohibitions and shadowed by omens, and there were those even then who chafed at it, who longed to be free of the old fears, who welcomed the disenchantment that was slowly coming as a liberation, a lifting of the long burden of superstition. But there was the other face too, and it is the one we feel the loss of. To live in the realm of belief was also to live in a world that was never empty, never merely mechanical, never indifferent. It was to live accompanied, watched over, addressed, in an universe thick with meaning and attention, where the fire spoke to you and the birds brought you news, and the sky blessed your weddings and wept at your graves, and the very dead were only just beyond the lamp. It was to be, however, precariously at home in the world, woven into it, in conversation with it, never alone under a blank, indifferent heaven, but always companioned by the great web of signs and meanings, always significant, always seen. We have bought our freedom from the old fears at the price of that companionship, and we have gained much by the bargain, our medicine and our safety, and our release from the long dread. But on certain nights, perhaps, lying in the dark as you lie now, we feel the cost of it too, the silence where the world used to speak, the emptiness of a heaven that no longer notices us, and we understand, a little, why they held to their enchanted age so long, and reached so hard across the dark, and were so loath to let it go. And are we so very different? We have our medicine now, and our science, and we have pushed death back to the edges of life and learned to control so much that they could not, and we have let go, mostly, of the omens and the charms, but stand in our own lives a moment. We still knock on wood, we still feel the chill at the unlucky number, still carry our small lucky things, still feel that the universe owes us meaning, still reach when we lose what we love, for some sense that it is not wholly gone. We have not escaped the older age so completely as we like to think. We have only turned down its lamp, as the seance room lamp was turned down, until we can pretend not to see it, while underneath, in the dark, the old human longings go on exactly as they always did, the longing for meaning, the longing for protection, the longing, above all, not to be parted forever from our dead. The Victorians simply kept the lamp a little higher, and lived more openly inside the mystery, and surrounded themselves with the signs and charms and consolations that we have mostly put away but never quite outgrown. Let us end our wandering through the customs with one more, simple and human, the wishing, for of all the things the Victorians did in their realm of signs, the making of wishes was the gentlest and the most hopeful, and it survives among us more than almost anything. There were so many occasions for a wish. The first star of the evening, wished upon with the old rhyme, the new moon glimpsed clean over the right shoulder, the wishbone of the fowl pulled between two people, the one who took the larger piece to have their wish, the load of hay passing on the road, the white horse seen, the falling star, that brief streak of light wished upon before it died, the eyelash fallen on the cheek, placed on the back of the hand and blown away, the first fruit of the season tasted with a wish, the candles on a cake blown out in one breath with a wish kept secret lest the telling of it break the charm, 100 small openings in the day through which a person might send up a hope, a longing, a wish, into a world believed to be listening. And there is the heart of the whole enchanted age, perhaps, in that small act of wishing, for what is a wish but the lifting of the heart's desire toward an universe one hopes is paying attention, the refusal to believe that hope is pointless, that no one is listening, that the longing falls into emptiness. The Victorian wished on the star and the new moon and the wishbone because they lived in a world where wishing made sense, where the heart's longing might be heard and answered, where one was not alone with one's hopes under a blank sky. And we wish still on our stars and our birthday candles and our wishbones, more than half laughing, not quite believing, and yet doing it, sending up the small hope into the dark, because something in us cannot quite stop, cannot quite accept that no one is listening, still reaches, as they reached, for a world that hears us. In the wish, the oldest and simplest of the enchanted world's customs, the one we have kept most faithfully of all, the old longing lives on in us undimmed, the longing to be heard, to be answered, to matter to the universe, to send our hopes into the night and believe, against all our knowing, that the night receives them. So as you lie there now, in the quiet, with the dark gathered close around you, perhaps you can feel a little of what it was to live in that older age, where the bird at the window meant something, and the mirror was a doorway, and the dead were only just out of reach beyond the turned-down lamp. It was a world of more fear than ours in many ways, but also of more meaning, a realm where nothing was merely itself and everything spoke, where you were never quite alone under an indifferent sky, but watched and answered and accompanied by an universe thick with signs. We have traded that enchantment for our certainties, and gained much, and lost something too. And tonight, for a few hours, we have gone back and walked through it again, and felt it become real. The enchanted world of the Victorians, with all its strangeness and all its sorrow and all its deep and unmistakable humanity. If wandering through these vanished ages is something you would like to do again, you are always welcome to subscribe and to keep me company the next time we go somewhere like this, into some other lost corner of the past. There is no hurry about any of it. There will be another evening and another sphere to walk through together, and I would be glad of your company when it comes. But for tonight, that is enough. The lamp is low, the fire is sinking, the old enchanted life is fading gently back into the dark from which we called it. Let it go now, and let your mind grow quiet, and let yourself drift down towards sleep, carried by the soft, strange company of all those vanished people who watched the birds and turned the silver in their pockets and reached across the dark for the ones they loved. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.